December 13th, 1943, 9:27 in the morning. Second Lieutenant Philip Adair pulled his Curtiss P-40 Warhawk into a climbing turn over Assam, India, and saw 64 Japanese aircraft materializing through the morning haze 3 miles east. 24 bombers, 40 fighters, all heading directly toward his airfield at Dinjan. He was the only American pilot airborne. 1 pilot, 1 obsolete fighter, 64 enemy aircraft. Standard doctrine said wait for reinforcements, but the bombs would be falling in 12 minutes, 64-1. Philip Adair pushed the throttle forward and attacked alone. Philip Randolph Adair was born on March 17, 1920, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the second of 3 children in a family that had lived in Oklahoma since the land rush of 1889. His father, William Adair, owned a small construction company that built houses and commercial buildings throughout Tulsa County during the oil boom years of the 1920s. The business prospered modestly, providing the family with comfortable middle-class existence in a city that was transforming from frontier town to modern urban center through petroleum wealth. Philip grew up watching Tulsa's skyline rise during the construction boom that accompanied oil discoveries. The city's population exploded from 72,000 in 1920 to 141,000 by 1930. New buildings appeared constantly. Philip's father worked on several prominent projects, including office buildings downtown and residential developments in the expanding suburbs. The boy accompanied his father to construction sites regularly, learning about structural engineering, project management, and the satisfaction of building things that would endure. But Philip's interests extended beyond construction. He became fascinated with aviation during childhood, a fascination that intensified after Charles Lindbergh's transatlantic flight in 1927 when Philip was 7 years old. The newspapers and newsreels celebrated Lindbergh's achievement extensively. Aviation became glamorous and heroic rather than merely experimental and dangerous. Young boys across America wanted to become pilots. Philip was among them, spending hours at Tulsa's McEntire Airport, watching aircraft take off and land, studying their movements and imagining himself at the controls. His father encouraged this interest within practical limits. William Adair believed in education and preparation rather than impulsive dreams. He expected Philip to finish high school, attend college, and develop skills that would support a career and family. Aviation could be a hobby or secondary interest, but shouldn't distract from practical goals. Philip accepted this guidance and performed adequately in school, earning grades good enough for college admission while maintaining his fascination with aircraft and flying. The Depression affected Tulsa less severely than many American cities because oil production continued providing employment and economic activity even as other industries collapsed. William Adair's construction company survived, though business declined significantly between 1929 and 1933. The family maintained their home and lifestyle through careful financial management and William's reputation for quality work that kept him employed when other contractors failed. Philip learned about resilience and perseverance during these years, watching his father work longer hours for less money while maintaining professional standards and business integrity. Philip graduated from Will Rogers High School in Tulsa in June 1938 at age 18. His grades qualified him for admission to Oklahoma Agricultural and Mechanical College in Stillwater, approximately 60 miles northeast of Tulsa. The school, which would later become Oklahoma State University, offered engineering programs that interested Philip and aligned with his father's expectation that he pursue practical technical education. Philip enrolled in mechanical engineering in September 1938, intending to study structural design and potentially join his father's construction business after graduation. College life at Oklahoma A&M suited Philip reasonably well. He was a competent, though not outstanding, student, earning B grades in most subjects and struggling somewhat with advanced mathematics, but excelling in practical mechanical courses that involved hands-on problem-solving. He joined the Engineering Society and participated in student projects, designing and building mechanical devices. He made friends among other engineering students and dated occasionally, though he formed no serious romantic relationships during his college years. The growing international tensions and possibility of American involvement in foreign wars became increasingly prominent during Philip's college years. Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, starting World War II in Europe. Japan was expanding aggressively in China and Southeast Asia. The United States remained officially neutral, but was clearly preparing for potential conflict through military expansion and industrial mobilization. The Selective Training and Service Act of 1940 established America's first peacetime conscription, requiring young men to register for possible military service. Philip registered for the draft in October 1940 as required by law. His student status provided temporary deferment, but he understood that deferment could be revoked if the international situation deteriorated further. He watched the war news carefully, following German victories in France and the Low Countries during spring 1940, the Battle of Britain during summer and fall 1940, and the expansion of conflict into North Africa and the Balkans during 1941. American entry into the war seemed increasingly likely despite official neutrality. The decision point arrived on December 7, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and brought the United States into World War II. Philip was in his senior year at Oklahoma A&M, approaching graduation in May 1942. The Japanese attack created immediate widespread enlistment among college students nationwide. Many of Philip's classmates left school immediately to volunteer for military service. Philip considered doing the same, but decided to complete his engineering degree first, reasoning that technical education might prove valuable during military service and that a few months' delay wouldn't significantly affect his contribution to the war effort. He graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in mechanical engineering in May 1942 at age 22. His grades were adequate for graduation, though not distinguished enough to attract offers from major corporations or defense contractors who were hiring engineers aggressively to support war production. Philip wasn't particularly interested in civilian engineering work during wartime anyway. He had decided months earlier that he would pursue military aviation, finally acting on the childhood fascination that had never diminished, despite years of focusing on practical education and career preparation. On June 8, 1942, Philip walked into the Army Air Force's recruiting office in Tulsa and volunteered for pilot training. The recruiting officer reviewed his background and qualifications. College graduate with engineering degree, age 22, good physical condition. No prior military experience, but technically educated and mechanically capable. He was exactly the type of candidate the Air Forces wanted for pilot training programs that were expanding rapidly to meet wartime demands for aircrew. The officer explained the training pipeline. Philip would report to an aviation cadet classification center for evaluation and testing. Based on performance, he would be assigned to pilot training, navigator training, or bombardier training. Not everyone qualified for pilot training because the physical and mental requirements were demanding. But Philip's educational background and apparent aptitude suggested he would likely qualify if he passed the medical examination and aptitude tests. Philip spent his final weeks in Tulsa preparing for military service and saying goodbye to family and friends. His father was proud but worried, understanding that pilot training was merely preparation for combat operations where casualties were high and survival uncertain. His mother cried quietly when Philip boarded the train for San Antonio, Texas, where he would report for initial processing. His younger brother and sister were excited about their older brother becoming a pilot and fighting against the Japanese and Germans. The mixture of pride, fear, and patriotic enthusiasm was typical of families sending sons to war throughout America in summer 1942. Philip reported to the San Antonio Aviation Cadet Center in late June 1942 for classification processing. The facility was overwhelmed with recruits arriving daily from across the country. Philip spent 5 days completing paperwork, undergoing medical examinations, taking aptitude tests, and receiving initial military orientation. The medical examination confirmed he was physically qualified for pilot training with normal vision, hearing, and cardiovascular function. The aptitude tests measured mechanical comprehension, spatial reasoning, hand-eye coordination, and stress response. Philip performed well enough to qualify for pilot training, receiving assignment orders in early July. Primary flight training would be conducted at Chickasha Army Airfield in Oklahoma, approximately 100 miles southwest of Tulsa. The assignment meant Philip would train relatively close to home, though contact with family would be minimal during the intensive training schedule. Primary training lasted approximately 2 months and covered basic flight skills, including takeoffs, landings, navigation, emergency procedures, and fundamental aerobatic maneuvers. Students flew Stearman PT-17 biplane trainers, rugged aircraft designed to withstand the abuse that student pilots inevitably inflicted during their learning process. Philip began primary training in July 1942 and immediately discovered that flying an aircraft was significantly more difficult than he had imagined. The Stearman was responsive and unforgiving. Control inputs produced immediate reactions. Mistakes were obvious and sometimes dangerous. Several students washed out during the first few weeks, unable to master basic coordination or overcome fear and air sickness. Philip struggled initially, but persevered through determination and his engineering background, which helped him understand the physics of flight and how control surfaces affected aircraft behavior. His first solo flight occurred after approximately 8 hours of dual instruction. The instructor climbed out of the front cockpit, looked back at Philip, and said simply, "Don't crash." Philip taxied to the runway, advanced the throttle, and took off alone for the first time. The sensation was extraordinary and terrifying simultaneously. No instructor was present to correct mistakes or take control during emergencies. Philip flew the pattern, landed successfully, though not smoothly, and taxied back to the flight line with a mixture of relief and exhilaration. He had soloed. He was becoming a pilot. Primary training continued through August with progressively more complex maneuvers and procedures. Philip learned stalls and spins and how to recover from them. He practiced forced landing procedures, simulating engine failures. He flew cross-country navigation exercises using maps and visual landmarks. He performed aerobatic sequences including loops, rolls, and chandelles. The training was demanding and eliminated approximately 25% of students who couldn't maintain acceptable performance standards. Philip survived, completing primary training in early September with adequate, though not exceptional, ratings. Basic flight training began at Randolph Field near San Antonio in September 1942. This phase introduced instrument flying, formation flying, and advanced aerobatics in North American AT-6 Texan trainers. The AT-6 was faster and more powerful than the Stearman, with retractable landing gear, variable pitch propeller, and instruments more representative of combat aircraft. The training intensity increased significantly. Students flew multiple times daily when weather permitted. Academic instruction covered navigation, meteorology, aircraft systems, and tactical procedures. Physical training maintained fitness. Military discipline was strictly enforced. Philip adapted to the increased demands and began developing genuine pilot skills rather than just basic competence. His hand-eye coordination improved. His situational awareness developed through practice and experience. He learned to anticipate aircraft responses rather than simply reacting to them. His formation flying became smoother as he mastered the precise control inputs needed to maintain position relative to other aircraft. His instrument flying improved through repetition until he could maintain altitude and heading without visual references to the ground. Advanced flight training at Moore Field near Mission, Texas, began in December 1942. This final phase specialized students into single-engine fighter pilots or multi-engine bomber pilots based on aptitude and Air Force's needs. Philip was assigned to single-engine fighters, which meant training in more powerful aircraft and learning gunnery, dive bombing, and tactical combat procedures. The training aircraft were P-40 Warhawks, the same type he would later fly in combat. The P-40 was considerably more challenging than the AT-6, with significantly more power and speed that demanded precise control and constant attention. If you want to see how Philip Adair turned himself into a combat-ready fighter pilot and what happened when he faced 64 Japanese aircraft alone over India, please hit that like button. It helps us share these forgotten stories with more people. Subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss what happens next. Back to Philip's training and his journey to the China-Burma-India theater. The gunnery training at Moore Field taught Philip the fundamentals of aerial combat. He learned deflection shooting, understanding how to aim at where a moving target would be rather than where it currently was. He practiced on ground targets first, firing at fabric panels towed behind trucks. Then came aerial gunnery, firing at sleeves towed behind other aircraft. The .50 caliber Browning machine guns mounted in the P-40's nose and wings were powerful weapons, but effective use required skill and practice. Philip's accuracy improved gradually through repetition and instruction. Dive bombing training taught procedures for attacking ground targets from steep angles, releasing bombs at specific altitudes and airspeeds to achieve accuracy while avoiding ground fire. Tactical formation, flying simulated combat scenarios where flights of 4 aircraft work together to attack ground targets or engage enemy fighters. Philip learned to function as part of a coordinated team rather than a solo pilot, understanding that survival in combat often depended on mutual support among squadron members. He completed advanced training in March 1943 and received his silver pilot wings and commission as Second Lieutenant in the Army Air Forces. The ceremony at Moore Field was brief and understated. Approximately 60 graduates received their wings that day. Their families attended when possible. Philip's parents drove down from Tulsa to watch their son pin on the wings he had dreamed about since childhood. The celebration was tempered by understanding that graduation meant deployment to combat theaters where many pilots would die within months. Philip received assignment orders to the 10th Air Force, which operated in the China-Burma-India theater, supporting Allied operations against Japan in that vast and challenging region. The CBI theater was less glamorous and received less attention than operations in Europe or the Pacific Islands, but the fighting was intense, and the conditions were among the most difficult anywhere in the war. Philip would deploy to India in April 1943 after brief leave to visit family in Tulsa. The leave lasted 10 days. Philip spent time with his parents, siblings, and friends, knowing it might be the last time he saw them. Conversations were awkward because everyone understood the dangers Philip faced, but nobody wanted to discuss mortality explicitly. His father gave advice about staying alert and following procedures. His mother gave him a small Bible to carry. His younger brother asked questions about combat tactics that Philip couldn't answer because he hadn't experienced combat yet. The farewell at the train station was emotional and brief. Philip boarded, heading for the West Coast and transport to India. The journey to India took approximately 3 weeks via multiple transport aircraft and ships. Philip traveled from Tulsa to San Francisco by train, then by ship to Australia, then by air transport to Calcutta, India. The route was circuitous and time-consuming, but necessary because direct routes across the Pacific were too dangerous due to Japanese control of much of that region. Philip traveled with dozens of other newly trained pilots and air crew, heading to various units throughout the CBI theater. They exchanged stories about training experiences and speculated about what combat would actually be like once they arrived. Philip reached Calcutta in late April 1943 and reported to 10th Air Force Headquarters for assignment processing. He received orders to the 80th Fighter Group, one of the primary American fighter units operating in the CBI theater. The 80th, nicknamed the Burma Banshees, flew P-40 Warhawks in support of Allied ground forces and in defense of supply routes, including the critical hump airlift that transported material from India to China over the Himalayan mountains. The group consisted of 3 squadrons, the 88th, 89th, and 90th Fighter Squadrons, each assigned approximately 25 aircraft and pilots. Philip was assigned to the 89th Fighter Squadron based at Dinjan Airfield in Assam, northeast India, approximately 150 miles west of the Burma border. Dinjan supported operations protecting the southern terminals of the hump airlift route, where C-47 transport aircraft loaded supplies before flying over the Himalayas to Chinese airfields. Japanese forces controlled Burma and frequently launched air attacks against Allied airfields in India, attempting to disrupt the supply operations. American fighter squadrons at Dinjan and nearby bases flew defensive patrols and offensive sweeps into Burma, attacking Japanese airfields and ground targets. Philip arrived at Dinjan in early May 1943 and began the transition from training pilot to combat pilot. The squadron commander, Major Robert Scott, was an experienced fighter pilot who had been flying combat missions since early 1942. Scott emphasized survival over heroics. His briefings stressed disciplined tactics, mutual support, and avoiding unnecessary risks. The squadron had lost approximately 40% of its original pilots during the previous year. Replacements arrived regularly, but took time to develop combat effectiveness. Many were killed during their first few missions before gaining the experience and judgment needed to survive. Philip flew his first combat mission on May 15, 1943, a routine defensive patrol over Dinjan Airfield. The mission lasted 2 hours and encountered no enemy aircraft. Philip spent the time learning to maintain formation position, practice radio procedures, and become familiar with the local geography. The Assam region was densely forested with rugged terrain, numerous rivers, and limited landmarks for navigation. Getting lost over the jungle meant potential crash landing in territory where rescue was unlikely, and Japanese patrols operated regularly. Subsequent missions gradually exposed Philip to the realities of combat operations in the CBY theater. Some missions involved escorting C-47 transports during hump flights, providing fighter protection against Japanese interceptors that occasionally attacked the vulnerable cargo planes. Other missions involved offensive sweeps into Burma, attacking Japanese airfields, supply lines, and troop concentrations. Still other missions involved defensive patrols, protecting Allied installations in India against Japanese bombing raids that arrived irregularly, but caused significant damage when they succeeded. Philip's first encounter with enemy aircraft occurred on June 3, 1943, during an escort mission over the mountains. A flight of 4 P-40s was protecting 2 C-47s heading toward Kunming, China, when 6 Japanese fighters appeared approximately 10 miles west of the Burma-China border. The Japanese pilots were professionals flying Nakajima Ki 43 Oscar fighters, highly maneuverable aircraft that could outturn the heavier P-40s in sustained dogfights. The American flight leader ordered his pilots to maintain formation and protect the transports rather than pursuing the Japanese fighters. Philip wanted to engage but followed orders, staying with the C-47s while the Japanese fighters circled at a distance, apparently evaluating whether to attack. After several minutes of maneuvering, the Japanese broke off and disappeared into cloud cover without attacking. Philip felt frustration at not engaging, but understood the leader's decision prioritized protecting the transports over seeking combat. The mission continued successfully, with the C-47s reaching their destination and the P-40s returning to Dinjan without incident. The squadron lost its first pilot during Philip's time with the unit on June 23, 1943. Second Lieutenant James Morrison was shot down during a ground attack mission against a Japanese airfield near Myitkyina, Burma. Morrison's aircraft took anti-aircraft fire while strafing parked aircraft. His engine caught fire. He attempted to climb for bailout altitude, but the aircraft exploded before he could escape. The squadron held a brief memorial service that evening. Morrison's belongings were packed and shipped home. His name was added to the casualty list. Operations continued the next day because the war didn't pause for mourning. Philip flew approximately 40 missions between May and November 1943, accumulating combat experience and developing the skills and judgment that separated surviving pilots from casualties. He learned to scan the sky, constantly searching for threats. He learned to maintain situational awareness during the chaos of combat. He learned to trust his wingman and function as part of a coordinated team. He learned when to be aggressive and when to be cautious. He hadn't achieved any confirmed aerial victories yet, but he had survived 6 months of combat operations, which was an achievement in itself. The P-40 Warhawk that Philip flew was a reliable though somewhat obsolete aircraft by 1943 standards. Designed in the late 1930s, the P-40 had served throughout the war in multiple theaters, but was inferior to more modern fighters like the P-51 Mustang in most performance categories. The N model represented the final and most refined version of the design, incorporating improvements learned through years of combat experience. The aircraft was powered by an Allison V 1710-81 liquid-cooled engine, producing 1,240 horsepower at 3,000 RPM, giving the Warhawk a maximum speed of 378 miles per hour at low altitude. The P-40N carried 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 3 mounted in each wing outboard of the propeller arc. Each gun was belt-fed and could fire approximately 800 rounds per minute when functioning properly. Total ammunition capacity was approximately 1,000 rounds per gun, providing roughly 12 to 15 seconds of sustained fire depending on the rate selected. The guns were synchronized to converge at approximately 300 yards ahead of the aircraft, creating a concentrated cone of fire effective for destroying enemy aircraft or strafing ground targets. Philip's aircraft was nicknamed Lulu Bell and marked with the number 44 painted prominently on the fuselage. The name honored Philip's girlfriend back in Oklahoma, though their relationship was more hopeful than serious, given the long separation and uncertain future. The artwork was simple compared to the elaborate nose art common on bombers, just the name in white letters on the olive-drab fuselage. The aircraft showed accumulated wear from 6 months of tropical operations. The paint was faded and chipped. Fabric control surfaces showed repairs. The engine required constant maintenance to keep running reliably in the humid climate that corroded metal and degraded lubricants. The squadron's mission during late 1943 focused increasingly on protecting the hump airlift, which had become critically important to sustaining Chinese resistance against Japan. The airlift transported thousands of tons of supplies monthly from India to China over the Himalayan mountains. The only supply route available after Japan captured Burma and closed the Burma Road. Japanese forces recognized the airlift's importance and launched frequent attacks against both the Indian terminals where C-47s loaded cargo and the Chinese terminals where they unloaded. American and British fighter squadrons provided defensive protection and conducted offensive operations attempting to suppress Japanese air power in Burma. December 1943 began with increased Japanese air activity throughout the region. Intelligence reports indicated Japan was concentrating fighter and bomber units in Burma for major operations against Allied installations in northeast India. The attacks were timed to coincide with Japanese ground offensives planned for early 1944 that would attempt to invade India and cut the supply routes to China. Air superiority was essential for supporting those ground operations. Japanese air commanders were assembling strength for coordinated large-scale attacks that would overwhelm Allied defenses through sheer numbers. On December 12, 1943, intelligence briefings at Dinjan warned that major Japanese raids were imminent within the next few days. Specific timing and targets were unknown, but the patterns of reconnaissance flights and radio intercepts suggested attacks would occur soon. Squadron readiness increased. Aircraft were fueled and armed. Pilots were restricted to base. Alert flights maintained constant patrols over Dinjan and nearby installations. The weather was clear with excellent visibility, perfect conditions for air operations. Japanese bombers would likely exploit the weather to launch maximum effort attacks, while conditions favored navigation and bombing accuracy. Philip slept poorly the night of December 12th. The anticipation and tension affected most pilots before major operations. Some men played cards to distract themselves. Others wrote letters home. Some sat quietly processing fear and determination privately. Philip lay in his bunk, reviewing procedures mentally, visualizing combat scenarios and how he would respond. He had flown 43 combat missions without achieving any aerial victories. Tomorrow might provide opportunities for success, or might be the day he died. Either outcome was possible and largely beyond his control. All he could do was perform competently and hope circumstances favored him. The wake-up call came at 0530 hours on December 13, 1943. Philip dressed quickly in his flight suit and walked through the pre-dawn darkness to the mess tent, where breakfast was available for pilots scheduled to fly. He ate mechanically without tasting the food, fueling his body for whatever the day would bring. Other pilots ate quietly around him, each processing the day ahead privately. The squadron operations officer briefed the first patrol flight that would take off at dawn to establish defensive coverage over Dinjan. Philip wasn't assigned to that flight. He would fly the second patrol beginning at 0900 hours. At 0830, Philip walked to the flight line where ground crews had prepared the P-40 overnight. Lulu Bell sat on its hardstand, fueled, armed, and ready for combat. Philip conducted his pre-flight inspection, checking control surfaces, fluid levels, tire pressures, and all the details that could mean the difference between mechanical reliability and catastrophic failure. Everything appeared normal. The crew chief, Technical Sergeant Martinez, assured Philip the aircraft was in excellent condition despite its accumulated wear. The Allison engine had received fresh oil and a thorough inspection the previous day. All 6 50-caliber guns were loaded with full ammunition belts and test-fired to verify function. Philip climbed into the cockpit at 0850 and began his startup procedures. The Allison engine caught immediately and settled into smooth idle. Oil pressure normal, coolant temperature rising normally, electrical systems functioning, radio working, all instruments reading correctly. He taxied Lulu Bell to the runway and waited for takeoff clearance while performing final checks. The tower cleared him for takeoff at 0858. Philip advanced the throttle, the engine responded with smooth power, and the P-40 accelerated down the runway and lifted off at 0900 exactly. Philip climbed to 8,000 feet altitude and established a patrol pattern over Dinjan Airfield. The morning was clear with unlimited visibility. The Brahmaputra River Valley stretched north toward the Himalayas, which were visible as a white wall on the northern horizon. To the east lay Burma, where Japanese forces controlled the territory and launched attacks against Allied positions in India. To the west lay more Indian territory, where Allied air bases and supply depots supported operations throughout the theater. Dinjan sat at the intersection of these forces, a critical node in the supply network that kept China fighting. At 0927, Philip noticed something unusual to the east. A dark mass moving through the sky approximately 3 miles distant. Initially unclear what it was. Perhaps a cloud formation or weather phenomenon, but the mass maintained consistent altitude and heading. Not a cloud, something else. Philip strained his eyes and gradually resolved the mass into individual shapes. Aircraft, many aircraft, more aircraft than he had ever seen in one formation. He counted quickly and reached approximately 60 before losing track. The formation was still 3 miles away, but heading directly toward Dinjan. Philip keyed his radio transmitter and reported what he saw. "Tower, this is 4-4. I have a large formation of aircraft bearing 090, range 3 miles, altitude approximately 5,000 feet, heading this way. Appears to be enemy bombers with fighter escort. Request immediate reinforcements." The tower acknowledged his transmission and activated the base alert. Sirens wailed. Ground personnel ran toward air raid shelters. The remaining P-40s on the ground began emergency engine starts. But the nearest other fighters were at Jorhat, 38 minutes away, even at maximum speed. The bombers would reach Dinjan in approximately 12 minutes. Philip was alone, the only pilot airborne, the only thing between 64 Japanese aircraft and the target they intended to destroy. Philip Adair checked his fuel gauge one final time before committing to the attack. 180 gallons in the internal tank, approximately 90 minutes of flight time at combat power settings. The Japanese formation was 3,000 feet below him, moving at approximately 240 miles per hour toward Dinjan Airfield. The bombers flew in tight V formations, 24 Mitsubishi Ki, 21 Sally bombers, arranged in groups of 6 aircraft each. Above and around them, approximately 40 Nakajima Ki, 43 Oscar fighters provided escort in layered defensive positions designed to protect the bombers from exactly the type of attack Philip was about to make. Standard fighter doctrine was absolutely clear on this situation. A single pilot encountering enemy forces outnumbering him by more than 5-1 should not engage. The pilot should shadow the formation from a distance, report position and heading, and wait for reinforcements to arrive before attacking. Engaging alone against overwhelming odds was tactically unsound and strategically wasteful. Losing the fighter and pilot accomplished nothing except reducing Allied strength by 1 aircraft. The doctrine made perfect sense and was based on thousands of combat experiences accumulated since the war began. But doctrine assumed the fighter pilot had time to wait for reinforcements. Philip didn't have time. The Japanese bombers would reach Dinjan in approximately 12 minutes. The bombs would fall. The damage would be catastrophic. 14 C-47 transport aircraft sat on the airfield hard stands, loaded with supplies for Chinese forces fighting in Yunnan province. A field hospital treated 63 wounded soldiers who couldn't be moved quickly. Fuel stocks, sufficient to support hump operations for 11 days, were stored in above-ground tanks vulnerable to bombing. If those bombs fell unopposed, the Allied supply operations over the Himalayas would be disrupted for weeks or months. The nearest friendly fighters were at Jorhat Airfield, 38 minutes away, even at maximum speed. By the time they arrived, the bombs would already be falling, and the damage would be done. Philip could radio for help and shadow the formation, following doctrine and preserving his aircraft and himself for future missions. Or he could attack immediately, despite impossible odds, and try to disrupt the bombing run enough to save the airfield and the people on it. The choice was between tactically sound cowardice and tactically insane courage. Philip pushed the throttle forward. The Allison V-1710-81 engine responded immediately. The manifold pressure gauge climbed to 54 inches as the supercharger forced additional air into the cylinders. The engine roared. The P-40 accelerated rapidly. Airspeed increased from 220 miles per hour to 320 in approximately 30 seconds. Philip pulled the control stick back slightly and climbed to position himself 4,000 feet above the bomber formation, approaching from the south with the morning sun behind him, providing some concealment from enemy observers. The tactical advantage of surprise was Philip's only significant asset in this engagement. The Japanese pilots expected to encounter American fighters near Dinjan, not 20 miles out over sparsely populated jungle. Their attention was focused forward toward the target rather than scanning behind for threats that shouldn't exist yet. The Oscar escort fighters flew in formations above and beside the bombers, but hadn't spotted the single P-40 diving toward them from the sun. Philip had perhaps 30 seconds before someone noticed him. He needed to maximize the impact of that initial attack before the element of surprise evaporated and the Japanese fighters swarmed him. The lead Sally bomber formation flew in a tight V of 6 aircraft, with 2 such groups arranged one behind the other, creating a formation of 12 bombers total. This was the primary strike element that would drop the majority of the bomb load on Dinjan's most critical targets. Philip selected this formation as his initial target. If he could break their bombing accuracy by scattering the formation, the subsequent bomb drops would be spread across miles of jungle instead of concentrated on the airfield. Even if he couldn't stop the raid completely, reducing accuracy would minimize damage. Philip rolled the P-40 inverted at 4,000 feet above the bombers, pulled the nose down sharply, and entered a diving attack from their 7 o'clock high position. The dive angle was approximately 60 degrees, steep enough to build speed rapidly and present a difficult target for defensive gunners, but not so steep that he couldn't pull out without excessive G-forces or altitude loss. His airspeed built quickly during the dive. 340 miles per hour, 360, 380. The P-40's airframe stressed under the aerodynamic loads, but remained solid. The Allison engine screamed at maximum power, propeller tips approaching supersonic speeds and creating a distinctive whistling sound that Japanese soldiers would later describe as terrifying. Range to target decreased rapidly during the dive. 2,000 yards, 1,500, 1,000. The Sally bombers still hadn't seen him. Their defensive gunners were scanning forward and to the sides, but not behind and above where threats weren't expected. At 800 yards, Philip centered the lead bomber in his gun sight and pressed the firing button. All 650 caliber Browning machine guns opened fire simultaneously. The sound and vibration filled the cockpit. Tracers arced toward the target, bright streaks marking the trajectory of bullets, traveling at approximately 2,600 feet per second. The convergence point of the 6 guns was set at 300 yards ahead of the aircraft. At 800 yards, the bullets were still spreading and hadn't yet converged to maximum concentration, but enough rounds connected to cause visible damage. Tracers walked up the Sally's left wing from trailing edge toward the engine nacelle. Fabric covering tore. Metal sparked where bullets struck aluminum structure. Then several rounds penetrated the engine cowling and struck critical components inside. The Mitsubishi HA-101 radial engine erupted in orange flame. Black smoke poured from the cowling. The bomber's port engine was destroyed. The Sally's pilot reacted immediately. With one engine dead and fire spreading, the aircraft couldn't maintain formation position. He broke left and descended, attempting to feather the damaged propeller and extinguish the fire before it reached the fuel tanks. His wingmen scattered reflexively to avoid collision. The tight V formation that had been holding perfect spacing dissolved into chaos as 6 bombers maneuvered independently. Their bombing accuracy was instantly degraded from the coordinated pattern bombing that would have saturated the target to individual drops that would be scattered and less effective. Philip pulled out of his dive at bomber altitude with approximately 7 G-forces pressing him into his seat. His vision grayed at the edges as blood drained from his brain toward his lower body. He tightened his abdominal muscles and grunted forcefully to maintain blood pressure and prevent unconsciousness. The gray edges retreated. His vision cleared. He rolled right and scanned for threats. The 40 Oscar fighters were diving toward him from multiple directions. The surprise was over. Now the real fight began. The Nakajima Ki 43 Oscar was one of the most maneuverable fighters in the entire Pacific Theater. Powered by a Nakajima HA-115 radial engine producing 1,150 horsepower, the lightweight fighter could reach 329 miles per hour at 13,000 feet and execute turning circles significantly tighter than any American fighter could match. The Oscar's butterfly combat flaps allowed it to bleed speed rapidly during turns without stalling, giving Japanese pilots tremendous advantage in sustained dogfights. In the previous 6 months, Oscars had shot down 63 Allied fighters over Burma and northeast India through superior maneuverability exploited by experienced pilots. Philip's P-40N was faster in straight-line flight and could dive more aggressively than the Oscar, but couldn't match the Japanese fighter's turn rate. The Warhawk's Allison engine generated more horsepower, but the aircraft was heavier, requiring more speed to maintain lift and energy. In a sustained turning fight, the P-40 would lose energy faster than the Oscar and eventually become vulnerable. Standard P-40 tactics against Oscars were simple and emphatic. Never turn with them, use speed advantage to hit and run, extend away after each attack to reset position. Never commit to sustained maneuvering combat. But Philip couldn't extend away. If he fled to preserve his aircraft and himself, the bombers would reform and complete their attack on Dinjan. He had to maintain pressure on the formation, keep them scattered and nervous, force them to focus on defending themselves rather than bombing accurately. Even if maintaining pressure meant fighting 40 Oscar fighters simultaneously in violation of every tactical principle he had been taught, the mission demanded it. The people on the ground at Dinjan depended on it. Philip accepted the tactical impossibility and prepared to fight anyway. The first 4 Oscars came at him in a loose finger 4 formation from his 10 o'clock high position, diving with approximately 50 miles per hour speed advantage. Philip rolled left, pulled the nose up toward the attackers, and fired a 2-second burst. Approximately 160 rounds from all 6 guns converged ahead of the formation. The bullets missed high as Philip had overestimated the Japanese pilot's dive angle. He adjusted aim slightly downward and fired again. This burst connected with the lead Oscar. Rounds sparkled across the fighter's engine, cowling, and right wing root. The Oscar broke right, trailing white smoke, either coolant or hydraulic fluid. Its wingman followed defensively. Philip reversed his turn immediately, diving away to maintain speed and avoid giving the remaining two Oscars an opportunity to position for shots. His airspeed increased to 340 miles per hour in the dive. He extended approximately 1 mile before pulling back up and reassessing the situation. The bomber formations were attempting to reform. 3 groups of 6 aircraft each were closing back together, trying to re-establish the tight spacing needed for effective pattern bombing. If they succeeded in reforming before reaching Dinjan, they could still execute a coordinated attack, despite Philip's initial disruption. Philip checked his ammunition counter. 800 rounds remaining across all 6 guns. He had expended approximately 200 rounds during the initial attack and the brief engagement with the Oscar fighters. At current expenditure rates, he had ammunition for perhaps 6 to 8 more attack runs before the guns went silent. The Japanese formation was still 15 miles from Dinjan. He had perhaps 4 to 5 minutes before they reached bombing range. Every second counted. Every attack that scattered the bombers bought additional time and reduced their accuracy. He pushed the throttle to the stop again and dove toward the right-hand sally formation, which had reformed into a reasonable approximation of bombing formation. 8 Oscar fighters followed him down, but couldn't match the P-40's dive speed. Philip opened the gap, pulled out at bomber altitude, and lined up on the lead bomber from approximately 300 yards range. He fired a 3-second burst. Approximately 240 rounds converged on the Sally's right engine. The Mitsubishi radial engine exploded in a brilliant fireball. Burning fuel sprayed backward along the fuselage. The bomber rolled right uncontrollably as the right wing lost lift from destroyed engine and fire damage. The aircraft entered a spin and fell toward the jungle 4,000 feet below. No parachutes appeared. The crew rode it down. The Sally's wingman broke formation violently to avoid collision with the falling bomber. Philip kicked right rudder, skidded the P-40 left without banking, and fired at the second bomber. This was a deflection shot requiring precise aim to compensate for both aircraft's motion. Several rounds struck the bomber's thin fuselage skin. The Kai-21 had been designed in 1936 with minimal armor protection and no self-sealing fuel tanks. It could carry 2,250 pounds of bombs effectively, but was extremely vulnerable to fighter attack. Even 50 caliber rounds that didn't hit critical components could cause catastrophic failures by rupturing unprotected fuel tanks or severing control cables. The 12 Oscar fighters were closing again from multiple directions. Philip counted them quickly. 3 from 10 o'clock, 4 from 2 o'clock, 5 from 12 o'clock high. They were coordinating their attacks to overwhelm his ability to defend against multiple threats simultaneously. He couldn't engage all of them effectively. He would have to choose which threats to address and accept hits from the others. The mathematics of survival were brutally simple. Eventually, accumulated damage would cripple his aircraft. The question was whether he could disrupt the bomber formation sufficiently before that happened. His fuel gauge showed 162 gallons remaining. His ammunition counter read 650 rounds. The bombers were 19 miles from Dinjan. He had perhaps 4 minutes before they reached drop range. Then his coolant temperature gauge began climbing into the red zone. The Allison V1710-81 was a liquid-cooled engine. Coolant circulated through passages in the cylinder heads and engine block, absorbing heat from combustion, then flowing through a radiator mounted beneath the fuselage where airflow dissipated the heat. The system was designed to handle sustained operation at combat power settings for approximately 20 minutes. Philip had been running at maximum power for 11 minutes. The coolant temperature gauge showed 230 degrees Fahrenheit. Normal operating temperature was 210. At 250, the engine would begin experiencing detonation and pre-ignition from excessive cylinder head temperatures. At 270, catastrophic failure became probable as aluminum pistons expanded from heat and seized against steel cylinder walls. Philip had three choices: reduce power to let the engine cool and abandon the attack, continue fighting at current power settings and risk engine failure, or ignore the gauge completely and hope the engine lasted long enough to complete the mission. The Sally bombers were 17 miles from Dinjan, still within range to turn back and bomb if they reformed their formations. Philip kept the throttle at maximum power. Two Oscar fighters came at him head-on. The closing speed exceeded 600 miles per hour. Both Japanese fighters opened fire at approximately 500 yards. Philip saw their muzzle flashes and the tracers walking toward his nose. He fired back immediately. His heavier .50 caliber rounds carried more kinetic energy and reached effective range at greater distance than the Japanese 7.7 millimeter machine guns. At 350 yards, several of Philip's rounds struck the left Oscar's engine cowling. The lightweight fighter shuddered, trailing white coolant vapor, and broke left hard. Its wingman followed the brake. Philip rolled right and dove, extending away from the threat while maintaining speed. His coolant temperature hit 240 degrees. The engine was running noticeably rougher. He could feel vibration through the control stick that hadn't been present earlier. Detonation was beginning in the cylinders where fuel-air mixture ignited from heat compression before the spark plugs fired. If this continued, the engine would destroy itself within minutes. The Sally bombers were 15 miles from target. Two formations of 6 aircraft each had reformed into bombing verses. The third formation remained scattered with individual bombers struggling to rejoin formation while maintaining distance from the American fighter that had destroyed 2 of their number and damaged several others. Philip went for the lead formation again, diving past 6 Oscar fighters at 390 miles per hour, too fast for them to intercept effectively. At bomber altitude, he leveled out and opened fire on the lead Sally from approximately 250 yards. His first burst hit the bomber's right wing root, where the wing attached to the fuselage. This was the structurally critical area bearing the entire load of the wing and its fuel tanks and weapons. Multiple .50 caliber rounds punched through the aluminum skin and severed internal structural members. The wing structure failed catastrophically. The outer wing panel folded upward and tore away completely. The Sally rolled inverted immediately and entered a violent spin. No parachutes emerged. The crew had no time to escape before the aircraft impacted jungle approximately 30 seconds later. The formation broke again. Bombers scattered in multiple directions. Their bombing accuracy was completely destroyed. Even if individual aircraft dropped their bombs now, the weapons would be distributed randomly across miles of territory instead of concentrated on Dinjan. The raid's effectiveness had been reduced from potentially catastrophic to merely annoying. Philip had succeeded in his primary objective of preventing coordinated bombing, but he was still alone against dozens of enemy aircraft and his engine was dying. Philip pulled up hard after the attack. His coolant temperature gauge showed 248 degrees. The engine vibration had increased noticeably. He could hear the irregular firing pattern indicating multiple cylinders were detonating rather than burning smoothly. If he didn't reduce power immediately, the engine would seize completely within minutes. But 8 Oscar fighters were diving on him from above, and he needed maximum power to evade them. He saw the Oscars late, rolled left to evade, but was too slow. 7.7 millimeter rounds punched through his right wing. Fabric covering tore, metal buckled. One round struck his right aileron control rod, the cable that transmitted control stick inputs to the aileron surface. The cable didn't break completely, but was damaged enough that aileron response became mushy and imprecise. Philip needed more right stick pressure to maintain level flight. The aircraft wanted to roll left continuously. He had to hold constant right stick pressure to prevent the unwanted roll. Another burst from a different Oscar walked up his fuselage from tail to nose. Rounds sparked off the armor plate behind his seat, the steel protecting him from rear attacks. Several rounds penetrated the thinner skin forward of the armor. One round hit the coolant reservoir behind the firewall, separating the engine compartment from the cockpit. Green coolant sprayed across the inside of the windscreen, partially obscuring Philip's forward vision. The engine temperature gauge climbed past 260 degrees. Steam erupted from seams in the cowling as coolant boiled and escaped as vapor. Philip's oil pressure gauge began dropping. Normal pressure was 60 pounds per square inch. The gauge showed 50, then 45, then 40. The Allison engine used oil pressure to lubricate connecting rods, crankshaft bearings, and camshaft bearings. Without adequate oil pressure, metal components ground against each other, generating friction and heat that accelerated wear and eventual seizure. Philip watched the gauge continue dropping. 35 pounds, 30, 25. The engine was dying from multiple causes simultaneously: excessive coolant temperature causing detonation, loss of coolant causing additional heating, loss of oil pressure causing bearing damage. Philip chopped the throttle, reducing manifold pressure from 54 inches to 40 inches. The engine RPM fell from 3,000 to 2,400. Power output decreased significantly. The P-40 could no longer maintain altitude. The aircraft began descending at approximately 1,000 feet per minute. The Oscars circled above, watching, waiting. They understood the American fighter was crippled and would crash soon. There was no need to waste ammunition or risk being hit by defensive fire. They could simply wait for gravity and mechanical failure to finish what their bullets had started. Then Philip's engine caught fire. Fire in a liquid-cooled aircraft engine follows a predictable and deadly sequence. First, burning coolant vaporizes inside the engine compartment and ignites. The flames spread forward along the engine cowling, drawn by the airflow created by forward motion. If the fire reaches the fuel lines running along the left side of the engine, the entire aircraft explodes within seconds. Philip had perhaps 30 seconds before that happened. Standard procedure for engine fires was immediate engine shutdown and bailout, but Philip was at 8,000 feet altitude, descending rapidly, and 12 miles from friendly territory over jungle where Japanese patrols operated regularly. He considered his options quickly. Bail out immediately over hostile territory where capture or death from exposure was probable. Attempt to glide toward friendly territory with a burning engine that would likely explode before he reached safety, or try an improvised fire suppression technique that might work or might accelerate the explosion. Philip chose the third option. He pulled the mixture control back to idle cutoff for 3 seconds, starving the engine of fuel. The flames decreased in intensity as available fuel burned without being replenished. He pushed the mixture control forward again. The engine coughed, caught, and continued running, though very rough. Power output had dropped to approximately 60%, not enough to climb, barely enough to maintain level flight. The flames didn't extinguish completely, but were reduced enough that the fuel lines weren't in immediate danger. Smoke poured from the cowling seams, filling the cockpit with acrid gray smoke that burned Philip's eyes and throat. He slid the canopy open. Wind blast at 180 miles per hour cleared some smoke, but made breathing difficult and created tremendous noise. his vision blurred from smoke irritation and tearing. His throat constricted reflexively, trying to prevent smoke inhalation. The immediate threat of explosion had been delayed, but not eliminated. The engine was still on fire, just burning less intensely. The Sally bombers were 13 miles from Dinjan, still close enough to turn and complete their attack. But their formations had disintegrated. Individual bombers were heading southeast toward Burma, rather than continuing toward the target. The raid was broken. The escort fighters were following the bombers, rather than continuing to engage Philip. The Japanese commander had apparently decided that losing 3 bombers and having the entire formation scattered wasn't worth pressing the attack. Dinjan Airfield was safe. Philip had succeeded. Now, he just needed to survive the flight home. Philip turned southwest toward Naguli, a secondary airfield approximately 43 miles from his current position. Naguli was closer than Dinjan and had emergency medical facilities if he could make it that far. Flying time would be approximately 15 minutes if the engine kept running. His fuel gauge showed 83 gallons. His oil pressure gauge showed 0. The needle had pegged at 0 approximately 2 minutes earlier. The Allison engine ran on oil pressure to lubricate its moving parts. Without pressure, the oil wasn't circulating. Metal ground against metal. Friction generated heat. Components expanded. Seizure was inevitable. The fact that the engine continued running at all defied mechanical logic. The connecting rods should have welded themselves to the crankshaft by now. The camshaft bearings should have seized. The engine should have locked up completely. But somehow, through momentum and whatever microscopic oil film remained coating the internal surfaces, the Allison continued producing power. Philip could feel increasing vibration through the airframe. The propeller wobbled visibly. The engine sounded like it was tearing itself apart from inside, but it kept running. 6 Oscar fighters followed him for several minutes, maintaining distance but observing his crippled flight. 1 Oscar pilot pulled alongside close enough for Philip to see his face clearly. The Japanese pilot gestured downward repeatedly. Land the aircraft. Surrender. Become a prisoner rather than dying in a crash. Philip ignored the gestures and continued flying toward Naguli. The Oscar pilot watched for another minute, then broke away. All 6 Oscars turned east toward Burma. The Americans weren't pursuing. There was no tactical reason to continue following a crippled enemy fighter that would crash soon anyway. Philip's altitude stabilized at approximately 6,000 feet, the maximum he could maintain with 60% power output. Smoke continued pouring from the engine, but the flames had died down to smoldering rather than active burning. Either the fire had consumed available fuel, or the lack of coolant flow had somehow starved it. The cockpit smoke decreased as well with the canopy open, though his eyes and throat still burned from the accumulated irritation. His vision remained blurred. Tears streamed down his face continuously, but he could see well enough to maintain heading toward Naguli. At 4,000 feet altitude, Philip's right aileron control cable snapped completely. The aileron, which had been responding mushily due to the damaged cable, suddenly flopped to full deflection. With the aileron stuck deflected right, the right wing generated more lift than the left wing. The P-40 rolled right violently. Philip hauled back on the control stick with both hands, trying to counter the roll with elevator input. Nothing happened. The elevator cables were damaged as well. He had no pitch control. The nose dropped. The aircraft entered a diving spiral. His airspeed increased rapidly. 200 miles per hour, 220, 250. The jungle rushed up toward him. Altitude 3,000 feet. 2,500, 2,000. The P-40 was spinning to the right and descending. Philip tried every control input he knew. Full left stick, full right stick, full forward stick, full back stick, rudder left, rudder right. None of it affected the aircraft's motion. The controls were so badly damaged that he had essentially no control authority remaining. The P-40 was flying itself toward impact, and Philip was simply along for the ride. Then he had an idea that bordered on insane. The damaged right aileron was forcing the right wing down because aerodynamic forces were acting on the deflected surface. The broken elevator cables left the horizontal stabilizer in a nose-down trim position, also due to aerodynamic forces and gravity pulling on the uncontrolled surface. But aerodynamics work in both directions, depending on the aircraft's orientation relative to the airflow. If Philip rolled the P-40 completely inverted, the aerodynamic forces would reverse. The right aileron, stuck in downward deflection, would force the right wing up instead of down when the aircraft was upside down. The elevator stuck in nose-down trim would push the tail down, which meant lifting the nose up when inverted. Flying the aircraft upside down would reverse the effect of the damaged controls. The damage killing him right side up might save him inverted. It was unprecedented and probably impossible. The P-40's fuel system was designed for positive G-forces, not sustained inverted flight. The engine might quit immediately from fuel starvation. The oil system would drain in the wrong direction. But staying right side up guaranteed a crash within seconds. Inverted flight might work. The choice was between certain death one way and probable death another way that at least offered some possibility of survival. At 1,800 feet above the jungle canopy, Philip rolled the P-40 completely inverted. -1 G pressed him against his shoulder straps. Blood rushed to his head. His vision turned red around the edges as blood pressure increased in his brain. The fuel system immediately protested the inverted attitude. The Allison engine coughed, sputtered, and nearly quit as fuel struggled to flow upward against gravity to reach the carburetor. Philip adjusted the mixture control richer to help fuel flow. The engine caught again, running extremely rough, but producing power. The nose came up, or down, depending on perspective. When flying upside down, up and down become confusing concepts. The descent rate decreased. At 1,200 feet altitude, the P-40 leveled out, flying inverted at 140 miles per hour. Philip held the inverted attitude for 40 seconds, maintaining altitude through careful controlled inputs. His airspeed increased gradually to 160 miles per hour. He was actually climbing slowly, approximately 50 feet per minute, though everything looked and felt completely wrong because the world was upside down. But fuel starvation returned as the engine consumed whatever fuel had initially flowed into the carburetor. The engine began cutting out intermittently. Philip had to roll right side up to allow fuel to flow properly again. When he rolled upright, the damaged controls immediately pushed the nose down. The P-40 descended at 600 feet per minute. He waited until losing 300 feet of altitude, then rolled inverted again. The nose came up. He climbed 200 feet before fuel starvation forced him right side up again. The pattern repeated. Inverted to climb, right side up to feed fuel properly. Flip climb, flip descend, flip climb. Philip alternated between upside down and right side up every 30 to 40 seconds, clawing for altitude with his damaged, dying aircraft through the most bizarre flying technique ever attempted in combat. The 6 Oscar fighters that had been following him earlier had turned back toward Burma. But if they had still been watching, they would have witnessed something unprecedented in aviation history. An American P-40 with a burning engine and destroyed flight controls, flying alternately inverted and upright, refusing to crash, refusing to quit, fighting for every foot of altitude with determination that defied logic. Philip continued his rolling climb toward Nguli. His altitude varied between 1,500 and 2,500 feet as he cycled through the inversion sequence. His fuel gauge showed 61 gallons remaining. The gauge might be inaccurate due to the inverted flight sloshing fuel around the tank, but he definitely had less than 30 minutes of fuel remaining, even if the engine didn't fail first from mechanical damage. Naguli was still 21 miles southwest. Approximately 11 more minutes if he could maintain current speed and the engine kept running. His oil pressure gauge remained pegged at 0. The coolant temperature gauge no longer registered at all. The needle had apparently melted off at some point during the overheating. Smoke still poured from the cowling, though the flames had died down completely. The engine vibration had increased to the point where the entire airframe shook continuously. Something was very wrong internally, probably multiple connecting rods running without proper lubrication, but the Allison somehow continued producing power through momentum and the extraordinary durability of its original construction. At 5,000 feet altitude, Philip spotted Naguli Airfield ahead. The runway, the control tower, the aircraft revetments, safety. But he faced a new problem. His landing gear was hydraulically operated. The hydraulic system ran on engine-driven pump pressure. His engine was producing minimal power and might quit completely any second. If he lowered the gear and the engine failed, he would crash short of the runway with the gear partially extended. If he kept the gear up and attempted a belly landing, the impact might rupture his fuel tanks, and the aircraft would burn with him trapped inside. He needed to get the gear down and locked before engine failure. Philip reached for the gear lever with his right hand. His hand was shaking, not from fear, but from carbon monoxide poisoning. The cockpit smoke had been accumulating for 14 minutes despite the open canopy. Carbon monoxide from engine combustion products was displacing oxygen in his blood. He pulled the gear lever down. Nothing happened. The hydraulic pump wasn't generating sufficient pressure with the engine at reduced power. The gear remained locked in the up position. The P-40 had a backup system, a manual hand pump mounted on the left side of the cockpit. 28 strokes of the pump handle would manually pressurize the hydraulic system enough to extend and lock the landing gear, but the hand pump required both hands for effective operation. If Philip released the control stick to pump with both hands, the damaged controls would immediately force the nose down and the aircraft would crash. He needed to hold the stick to maintain control while somehow pumping the gear down with one hand, which was physically impossible. Philip reached behind his seat and pulled his lap belt loose. He wrapped the belt around the control stick, looped it through the seat frame, and pulled it tight. The makeshift rig held the control stick in approximate neutral position. It wasn't perfect control, but it kept the aircraft flying more or less straight while freeing both his hands. He grabbed the hand pump with both hands and began pumping frantically. 5 strokes, 10, 15. At stroke 23, he felt resistance developing as hydraulic pressure built. At stroke 28, he heard a metallic thunk from beneath the cockpit floor. The left main gear had extended and locked. 3 seconds later, the right main gear followed with another thunk. The gear down position increased drag significantly. The P-40's airspeed fell from 160 miles per hour to 135, barely above the stall speed of 120. The engine was now producing perhaps 40% power, barely enough to maintain altitude with gear extended. Philip unwrapped his lap belt from the control stick and resumed manual control. Naguli's runway was 7 miles ahead, approximately 3 minutes at current speed. His vision was tunneling, gray edges closing in from periphery. Carbon monoxide was affecting brain function. He shook his head violently, trying to maintain alertness. 6 miles from the runway, his engine quit. The propeller windmilled to a stop. All power gone. The P-40 became a glider with terrible glide characteristics. The Warhawk's glide ratio was approximately 8-to-1, meaning from 2,000 feet altitude it could theoretically glide approximately 3 miles. But Philip's battle-damaged aircraft had worse aerodynamics than normal due to bullet holes disrupting airflow and bent metal, creating additional drag. His actual glide ratio was probably closer to 6-to-1. He was at 2,000 feet, 2 miles from the runway. Theoretically possible, but with no margin for error. Philip lowered the nose to maintain airspeed and prevent stalling. His descent rate increased to 700 feet per minute. At that rate, he would reach the ground short of the runway by approximately half a mile. He considered rolling inverted one more time to improve the glide ratio. Inverted flight generated less drag in some configurations because the aerodynamic forces acted differently. The principle had been mentioned briefly during training, though no instructor ever expected pilots to actually use it. At 1,800 feet altitude, 1 mile from the runway, Philip rolled inverted one final time. Blood rushed to his head. His vision grayed. He fought to maintain consciousness through sheer willpower. The inverted P-40 glided toward the runway with landing gear extended downward, which was aerodynamically incorrect, but structurally necessary. The gear doors, designed to handle air loads from below, were now subjected to loads from above, creating stress they weren't designed for. But the gear held. The control tower operators at Nguli saw an inverted P-40 approaching with landing gear extended, trailing smoke. Their first thought was that a Japanese pilot had stolen an American fighter and was attempting to strafe the field. Ground Crew Chief Technical Sergeant Robert Martinez grabbed binoculars and focused on the approaching aircraft. He saw the inverted P-40, saw the battle damage, saw smoke. Martinez ran toward the nearest 50 caliber machine gun position with 3 ground crew following. They reached the gun emplacement and began traversing the weapon toward the aircraft. Philip was at 400 feet altitude, half a mile from the runway threshold, still inverted. His vision was fading fast. Carbon monoxide and negative G forces were shutting down his brain. He had perhaps 20 seconds of consciousness remaining. He needed to roll upright, line up with the runway, and land. If he rolled too soon, the damaged controls would push the nose down and he'd crash short. If he rolled too late, he'd overshoot. At 200 feet altitude, 300 yards from the threshold, Philip rolled right side up. The damaged aileron immediately pushed the right wing down. He countered with full left stick, fighting the aircraft, forcing the wings approximately level. The nose wanted to drop from the damaged elevator. He pulled back on the stick. The broken cables gave him partial control, just enough. The P-40 descended toward the runway at a steep angle, nose high, wings wobbling, completely outside normal landing parameters. Martinez's gun crew tracked the aircraft. 3 seconds until it crossed the threshold. Martinez had to decide whether to fire. He held his fire. The P-40 crossed the threshold at 90 feet, descending much too fast. The aircraft dropped the last 90 feet in 4 seconds. The main wheels hit the concrete runway with crushing force. 7G impact. The gear struts compressed fully. The tail wheel slammed down. Metal shrieked. The right main gear collapsed. The right wing dropped. The wingtip hit the runway and dug in. The aircraft ground-looped right, spinning 180 degrees, throwing up sparks and concrete fragments. It skidded backward for 200 feet and stopped. Smoke billowed from the engine compartment. Fire crews raced toward the wreck. Philip sat motionless in the cockpit for 12 seconds. Then he released his shoulder straps, stood up, and climbed out onto the wing. His legs buckled. He caught himself on the wing root. Ground crew reached him and helped him down. Martinez arrived with the fire crew. They opened the cowling. The Allison engine was completely destroyed. Pistons seized, Crankshaft warped, oil pan ruptured, coolant everywhere. Philip walked around Lulu Bell with Martinez, counting the damage. 16 bullet holes in the fuselage, 7 in the right wing, 4 in the left. The right aileron control cable severed completely. Hydraulic reservoir punctured, electrical bundles cut. The engine showed catastrophic damage from overheating and oil starvation. Every cylinder was scored. 3 connecting rods were welded to the crankshaft. The coolant system was destroyed. Lulu Bell would never fly again. But Philip Adair had saved Dinjan Airfield. Intelligence confirmed all 24 Sally bombers had turned back without dropping their ordnance. 0 bombs hit Allied facilities, 0 casualties. The hump airlift continued without interruption. 1 pilot, 1 obsolete fighter, 64 enemy aircraft. December 13, 1943. Philip Adair proved impossible odds meant nothing when someone refused to quit. Flight surgeons examined Philip Adair approximately 30 minutes after he climbed out of the wrecked P-40 at Nguli. His hands were still shaking from carbon monoxide poisoning and adrenaline exhaustion. His eyes were red and swollen from smoke irritation. His throat was raw from inhaling combustion products. His uniform was soaked with sweat despite the relatively cool morning temperature. The doctors noted all these symptoms carefully while conducting their examination, understanding that the physical manifestations were only part of what Adair had experienced. The carbon monoxide test results shocked the medical staff. Philip's blood showed carbon monoxide levels of 18% saturation approximately 45 minutes after landing. Normal carbon monoxide levels in non-smokers were less than 1%. Levels above 10% typically caused severe symptoms including confusion, loss of coordination, and unconsciousness. Levels above 15% were frequently fatal. Philip had been flying with severe carbon monoxide poisoning for at least the final 11 minutes of his flight, maintaining control of a damaged aircraft through inverted maneuvers that required precise judgment and coordination while his brain was being deprived of oxygen. The senior flight surgeon, Captain James Morrison, documented Philip's condition extensively. The case was medically extraordinary. Morrison had treated dozens of pilots for combat injuries and various medical emergencies during his year in the China-Burma-India theater, but he had never encountered someone who had functioned effectively with carbon monoxide levels high enough to incapacitate most people. Morrison wrote in his medical report that Adair's continued consciousness and flying ability under such conditions demonstrated either exceptional physiological resistance to hypoxia or extraordinary willpower that allowed him to continue functioning despite impaired brain chemistry. Probably both factors contributed. Philip was admitted to the base hospital at Dinjan for observation and treatment. The carbon monoxide poisoning required monitoring to ensure no delayed complications developed. His smoke-damaged eyes and throat needed medication and rest to heal. The flight surgeons wanted to observe him for at least 72 hours before clearing him for return to flight duty. Philip protested that he felt fine and wanted to return to his squadron immediately, but the doctors were firm. Medical regulations required observation after significant carbon monoxide exposure. The regulations existed because delayed neurological effects sometimes appeared hours or days after the initial exposure. While Philip recovered in the hospital, intelligence officers were conducting detailed analysis of the December 13th raid and Philip's role in disrupting it. Reconnaissance flights over Burma confirmed that all 24 Sally bombers had returned to their base without dropping ordnance. Japanese radio intercepts decoded through Allied signals. Intelligence revealed that the raid commander had reported the attack as aborted due to unexpected fighter opposition that scattered the bomber formation before reaching the target. The Japanese assessment was that American fighters had ambushed the raid in force, not that a single P-40 had disrupted the entire formation. Ground crews at Dinjan confirmed that no bombs had fallen on the airfield. The 14 C-47 transports remained undamaged and continued flying hump missions without interruption. The field hospital continued treating wounded soldiers. The fuel stocks remained intact. The raid that intelligence had predicted would cause catastrophic damage to Allied supply operations had achieved exactly nothing except the loss of at least 3 bombers and damage to several others from Philip's attacks. The tactical success was complete and strategically significant. On December 16, 1943, 3 days after the mission, 10th Air Force Headquarters sent a team to interview Philip about the engagement. The team included intelligence officers who wanted tactical details about Japanese formations and tactics, operations officers evaluating the effectiveness of single-fighter defensive tactics, and training officers considering whether Philip's techniques should be incorporated into standard instruction. Philip spent approximately 4 hours describing the attack sequence, the inverted flying technique he had improvised, and the landing approach. The intelligence officers were particularly interested in the Oscar fighters' behavior. Philip described how they had initially swarmed aggressively, but became more cautious after he damaged several aircraft during the opening attacks. The Japanese pilots had demonstrated professional competence and good tactical coordination, but hadn't pressed their attacks as ruthlessly as they might have against a formation of bombers. Philip speculated that the Oscar pilots had been primarily focused on escorting the bombers to target rather than engaging in extended combat with a single fighter. Once the bombers turned back, the escort mission was essentially complete, and there was no tactical reason to continue fighting. The operations officers wanted to understand Philip's decision-making process. Why had he attacked alone against such overwhelming odds when doctrine clearly stated he should wait for reinforcements? Philip explained his reasoning simply. The bombers would have destroyed Dinjan if he hadn't disrupted their formation immediately. Waiting for reinforcements meant accepting that outcome. Attacking alone violated doctrine, but offered the only possibility of preventing the damage. He had evaluated the situation, made the decision, and accepted the consequences. The operations officers noted that Philip's tactical judgment had been sound, even though his tactical execution had been unorthodox. The training officers were fascinated by the inverted flying technique. No standardized training curriculum covered flying with completely failed flight controls by alternating between inverted and upright attitudes. Philip had improvised the technique based on understanding aerodynamics and desperate necessity. The training officers asked detailed questions about control inputs, fuel flow management, and spatial orientation while inverted. Philip answered as thoroughly as possible, but emphasized that he hadn't been thinking analytically during the sequence. He had been reacting to immediate problems and trying solutions that seemed like they might work. The technique had succeeded more through luck and the P-40's rugged construction than through any brilliant theoretical insight. The interview concluded with recommendations that Philip be recognized for his actions through appropriate decoration. The intelligence officer specifically noted that Philip's engagement had prevented significant damage to critical supply infrastructure and had forced Japanese air commanders to reconsider their assessment of Allied defensive capabilities. The operations officer recommended that Philip's case be studied as an example of effective decision-making under extreme uncertainty. The training officer suggested incorporating discussion of unconventional solutions to control failures into advanced pilot instruction, though he acknowledged that deliberately teaching pilots to fly inverted with damaged aircraft was probably impractical. On January 8, 1944, Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell, commander of United States forces in the China-Burma-India theater, traveled to Dinjan specifically to present Philip with the Silver Star Medal. Stillwell was a hard-bitten infantry officer who had little patience for ceremony or exaggeration. He had commanded American forces in China and Burma since early 1942 and had developed a reputation for blunt honesty and high standards. Stillwell didn't award decorations casually. When he presented medals, the recipients had genuinely earned them through actions that met his demanding criteria for courage and effectiveness. The ceremony was held outdoors on the flight line at Dinjan, with approximately 200 personnel attending, including pilots and ground crew from the 80th Fighter Group, support personnel from the airfield, and several senior officers from 10th Air Force headquarters. Philip stood at attention in his Class A uniform while Stillwell read the citation aloud. For gallantry in action against enemy forces on December 13, 1943, when Second Lieutenant Philip Adair, flying alone, engaged and disrupted a formation of 64 enemy aircraft attacking Allied installations, continuing his attack despite severe aircraft damage and personal injury, thereby preventing destruction of critical supply facilities and demonstrating extraordinary courage and devotion to duty that reflects great credit upon himself and the United States Army Air Forces. Stillwell pinned the medal on Philip's uniform, shook his hand firmly, and spoke briefly. "You did good work, Lieutenant. The kind of work that wins wars. Keep doing it and get home safe when this is over." The general's words were characteristically brief and sincere. No flowery rhetoric, no exaggeration, just acknowledgement that Philip had performed his duties effectively under difficult circumstances and should continue doing so. The ceremony concluded with dismissal and informal congratulations from fellow pilots and officers who had watched Philip's career since his arrival at Dinjan 8 months earlier. Philip returned to flight status in mid-January 1944 after medical clearance confirmed complete recovery from carbon monoxide poisoning. The squadron had received several replacement pilots during his hospital stay and recovery period. The new pilots looked at Philip with mixture of respect and curiosity. He was the pilot who had fought 64 Japanese aircraft alone and survived. The story had spread throughout the 10th Air Force and beyond. Some details had been exaggerated in retelling, which bothered Philip, who preferred accuracy to mythology. But he understood that dramatic stories served useful purposes in maintaining morale and providing examples for other pilots facing similar situations. His next combat mission occurred on January 23, 1944. An escort mission protecting C-47 transports flying the hump route to Kunming. The mission was routine and encountered no enemy aircraft. Philip found the routine comforting after the intensity of December 13th. Not every mission needed to be dramatic. Most missions were simply work, flying predictable patterns and following established procedures. The war consisted primarily of routine, punctuated by occasional moments of extreme intensity. Philip had experienced one of those extreme moments. Most of his remaining combat time would be routine, which was fine with him. The 80th Fighter Group's mission profile during early 1944 shifted increasingly toward offensive operations in Burma rather than defensive patrols over India. Allied ground forces were advancing slowly through northern Burma, attempting to reopen land supply routes to China. The fighter squadrons supported these operations by attacking Japanese airfields, supply lines, and troop concentrations. The missions were dangerous because they required flying deep into Japanese-controlled territory where engine failure or battle damage meant certain capture or death. But the missions were also strategically important because air superiority enabled ground advances that would eventually reopen the Burma Road. Philip flew approximately 8 to 10 missions monthly during the first half of 1944, accumulating experience and refining his skills through repetition and observation. He learned to identify threats more quickly by recognizing patterns in enemy tactics. He learned to conserve ammunition through more precise firing rather than spraying bullets wildly. He learned to evaluate situations faster and make tactical decisions with less hesitation. Combat experience couldn't be taught in training. It could only be acquired through actual combat and survival of enough missions to internalize the lessons. His first confirmed aerial victory after the December 13th engagement occurred on March 7, 1944, during an offensive sweep over northern Burma. Philip was flying as wingman in a flight of 4 P-40s attacking a Japanese airfield near Myitkyina when 6 Oscar fighters intercepted them approximately 10 miles from the target. The Japanese pilots attempted to engage the Americans in turning combat where the Oscars' superior maneuverability would provide advantage. Philip's flight leader recognized the trap and ordered the flight to maintain speed and avoid sustained maneuvering. Philip spotted one Oscar making a steep climbing turn, attempting to position above the American formation. The Japanese pilot was focused on the lead P-40 and hadn't noticed Philip approaching from his 6 o'clock position. Philip closed to approximately 200 yards and fired a 3-second burst. The .50 caliber rounds converged on the Oscar's fuselage and engine. The lightweight fighter shuddered, rolled inverted, and entered a flat spin. Philip didn't see it impact, but his wingman confirmed the Oscar crashed approximately 15 seconds later. The confirmation required witness testimony because gun camera footage alone was often insufficient to prove destruction. Philip's wingman had watched the entire sequence and verified the kill. The second confirmed victory came on April 19, 1944, during a ground attack mission against Japanese supply trucks moving along a road near Bamo. Philip's flight had completed their strafing runs and was climbing to return altitude when 2 Oscar fighters dove on them from above. The Japanese pilots had been waiting above the target area specifically to ambush Allied fighters during vulnerable moments after ground attacks when pilots were focused on navigation and fuel management rather than air defense. Philip saw the Oscars diving and called the warning over radio. His flight leader broke left. Philip broke right, separating the formation to complicate the Japanese pilots' targeting. One Oscar followed Philip's break. The Japanese pilot was aggressive and skilled, staying with Philip through several hard turns despite the P-40's inferior turn rate. Philip couldn't shake him through maneuvering alone. He needed to use speed and climb rate where the P-40 had advantages over the Oscar. Philip rolled wings level, pushed the throttle to maximum power, and climbed at full speed. The P-40's engine produced more horsepower than the Oscar's and could sustain higher climb rates. The Japanese pilot followed the climb initially, but gradually fell behind as the P-40 extended the gap. At 12,000 feet, Philip had approximately 500 yards separation. He pulled into a chandelle, a climbing turn that traded speed for altitude and position. At the top of the chandelle, he rolled inverted and looked back. The Oscar was still climbing toward him, but was now below and ahead of Philip's position. Philip rolled upright, pulled the nose down, and dove on the Oscar from above and behind. The Japanese pilot saw him coming and attempted to turn away, but Philip had too much speed and position advantage. He fired at 300 yards. The first burst missed. He adjusted aim and fired again. This burst connected solidly. The Oscar's engine exploded. The fighter rolled left, trailing fire and smoke. The pilot bailed out successfully. His parachute deployed, and he descended toward the jungle. Philip watched long enough to confirm the Oscar wasn't going to recover, then rejoined his flight for the return to base. These 2 victories brought Philip's total confirmed kills to 3. The December 13th engagement had been credited with 2 confirmed kills based on gun camera footage and witness statements from ground personnel at Dinjan, who had observed bomber wreckage falling from the formation. Adding the March and April victories gave Philip 3 confirmed kills toward the 5 required for ace status. Achieving ace status was meaningful primarily because it represented survival and effectiveness over extended combat operations. Many pilots flew dozens of missions without achieving any confirmed victories simply because aerial combat opportunities were unpredictable and confirmation requirements were strict. Philip's 4th confirmed kill occurred on June 2, 1944, during another ground attack mission in northern Burma. His flight was strafing a Japanese supply depot when 4 Oscar fighters attacked from high altitude. The ensuing combat was chaotic, with multiple aircraft maneuvering in a relatively small area of sky. Philip found himself briefly alone with 1 Oscar after the formation fragmented during hard maneuvering. The Japanese pilot made the mistake of trying to turn with Philip at high speed. The Oscar bled energy rapidly during the turn and slowed to approximately 180 miles per hour. Philip recognized the energy state immediately. The Oscar was slow and vulnerable. He pulled lead on the turning target and fired. His rounds walked through the Oscar's cockpit area. The Japanese pilot slumped forward. The Oscar's nose dropped, and the aircraft dove toward the ground without pulling out. No parachute appeared. The fighter impacted jungle approximately 8 seconds later. Philip's wingman confirmed the kill. 4 confirmed victories, 1 more for ace status. The final kill that made Philip an ace occurred on his final combat mission in the China-Burma-India theater on July 17, 1944. Philip had flown 94 combat missions by mid-July and was approaching the 100-mission threshold, after which pilots were typically rotated back to the United States for rest, reassignment, or training duty. His final scheduled mission was an escort flight protecting a formation of B-25 Mitchell bombers attacking Japanese positions near Lashio in northern Burma. The mission proceeded normally until the bombers completed their attack and began the return flight to India. 6 Oscar fighters intercepted the formation approximately 50 miles from the Chinese border. The American fighter escort consisted of 8 P-40s from Philip's squadron plus 6 P-51 Mustangs from another unit. The numerical balance was roughly even, but the Mustangs provided significant capability advantage over the older P-40s. The P-51's performance at altitude was far superior to both the P-40 and the Oscar. The Japanese pilots recognized the threat from the Mustangs and attempted to engage the P-40s preferentially, hoping to achieve quick victories before the faster Mustangs could intervene. 2 Oscars dove on Philip's flight from above. Philip broke into the attack, forcing the Japanese pilots to adjust their dive angle. 1 Oscar overshot and passed ahead of Philip's flight. The other Oscar pulled up to reset for another attack. Philip reversed his turn and climbed after the Oscar that had pulled up. The Japanese pilot saw Philip pursuing and attempted to extend away using speed. But the Oscar was already slow from the climbing maneuver and couldn't build speed fast enough. Philip closed to approximately 250 yards and fired. His rounds hit the Oscar's wing root and fuselage. The lightweight structure couldn't withstand multiple .50 caliber impacts. The wing folded and separated. The Oscar tumbled out of control. The pilot didn't bail out. The aircraft crashed in mountainous terrain. Within seconds, Philip spotted a second Oscar diving on one of the B-25 bombers, attempting to attack from the bomber's vulnerable 6 o'clock position. Philip dove after the Oscar, building speed rapidly. He closed to 300 yards and fired a long burst, approximately 4 seconds. The tracer stream converged on the Oscar's fuselage and engine. The Japanese fighter exploded spectacularly. Pieces of wreckage tumbled through the sky. The pilot's body separated from the aircraft without a parachute deploying. Philip pulled up hard to avoid flying through the debris field. 2 confirmed kills in one mission. Philip's total was now 7 confirmed aerial victories, exceeding the 5 required for ace status. His wingman and the bomber crews confirmed both kills through radio calls and post-mission debriefing. Gun camera footage verified the attacks, though the footage quality was poor due to smoke and distance. The combination of witness testimony and camera evidence was sufficient for official confirmation. Second Lieutenant Philip Adair was now officially recognized as an ace, one of approximately 1,000 American pilots who achieved that status during World War II. The squadron held a brief celebration that evening. Philip's fellow pilots congratulated him and shared drinks when alcohol was available, which wasn't often in the primitive conditions of forward airfields in India and Burma. The celebration was muted compared to what might have occurred at a base in England or the United States. The China-Burma-India theater was a harsh environment where survival and mission completion mattered more than achievements and decorations. Philip appreciated the recognition, but didn't consider himself particularly special. He had survived 100 missions through combination of skill, caution, and luck. Thousands of other pilots had done the same. Thousands more had died before completing their tours. Philip departed the China-Burma-India theater in September 1944 after completing 103 combat missions over 15 months. His final tallies included 7 confirmed aerial victories, approximately 40 ground attack missions where he had destroyed or damaged enemy vehicles and facilities, and 56 escort missions protecting bombers and transports. He had accumulated approximately 400 combat flying hours in P-40 Warhawks under conditions that ranged from routine to impossible. He had been shot at extensively and had survived through skill and fortune. He was 24 years old and looked 35 from stress and tropical diseases that plagued everyone serving in the CBI theater. The journey home took approximately 2 weeks via multiple air transports and ships. Philip traveled from India to Australia to Pearl Harbor to San Francisco, finally arriving in the United States in late September 1944. The war in Europe was still raging. The war in the Pacific would continue for another year, but Philip's combat service was complete for now. The Army Air Force's policy was to rest combat veterans for several months before reassigning them to training duty, staff positions, or potentially additional combat tours if the war continued long enough. Philip spent 30 days of leave in Tulsa, visiting his family for the first time in over 2 years. His parents barely recognized him initially. He had left as a 22-year-old recent college graduate. He returned as a 24-year-old combat veteran who had killed enemy pilots, survived being shot down, and accumulated experiences that separated him psychologically from the community that had remained safe at home. The gap between combat veterans and civilians was profound and largely unbridgeable. Philip's parents tried to understand what he had experienced, but the gulf was too wide. Philip appreciated their efforts, but knew they would never truly comprehend what combat was actually like. His younger brother asked constant questions about aerial combat and the technical details of flying fighters. Philip answered patiently, but edited his descriptions to remove the terror and brutality that were intrinsic to combat operations. Civilian understanding of war was shaped by propaganda films and patriotic narratives that emphasized heroism and victory while minimizing death and suffering. Philip couldn't reconcile the reality of his combat experience with the sanitized version civilians preferred. He learned to tell acceptable stories that satisfied curiosity without disturbing listeners with accurate descriptions of what combat actually involved. After leave, Philip received assignment to Randolph Field in Texas as a flight instructor training new pilots. The assignment was common for combat veterans who were considered too valuable to risk in additional combat, but whose experience was needed to train the next generation of pilots. Philip spent approximately 18 months at Randolph Field from late 1944 through early 1946, teaching basic and advanced flight techniques to aviation cadets who would deploy to Europe or the Pacific to replace casualties and support the ongoing war effort. The work was satisfying in ways that combat had never been. Philip could directly see his impact by watching students progress from struggling beginners to competent pilots who would survive their first combat missions through proper training. Combat had been intensely personal and immediate. Training was more abstract but potentially more impactful because each successful student represented multiple missions that would be flown effectively and safely. Philip took pride in his instruction and developed reputation as a demanding but fair teacher who prepared his students thoroughly for the realities of combat flying. The war ended while Philip was still at Randolph Field. Germany surrendered in May 1945. Japan surrendered in August 1945 after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The massive military mobilization began reversing immediately. Millions of servicemen returned to civilian life. Defense production ceased. Military bases closed. The Army Air Forces shrank from wartime peak of over 2 million personnel to peacetime strength of approximately 300,000. Philip faced a choice that all career military personnel confronted: stay in the service during peacetime with uncertain career prospects, or separate and pursue civilian opportunities. Philip chose to remain in military service. He had invested 4 years in developing his aviation skills and military career. Starting over in civilian aviation or returning to engineering seemed like abandoning that investment. The newly independent United States Air Force, which separated from the Army in September 1947, offered career opportunities for experienced officers. Philip applied for regular commission and was accepted, transitioning from wartime temporary officer to permanent career officer with the rank of captain. The months following Philip's ace achievement brought continued combat operations through the remainder of 1944. The war in Burma was intensifying as Allied ground forces advanced slowly through the jungle, attempting to reopen land routes to China. The 80th Fighter Group supported these operations continuously through ground attack missions, escort flights, and defensive patrols. Philip flew his final 6 missions in August and early September before receiving orders for rotation back to the United States. These final missions were routine by the standards Philip had established through 15 months of combat. He escorted transport aircraft over the Hump Route. He strafed Japanese supply convoys moving through northern Burma at night. He flew defensive patrols over Allied airfields. None of these missions involved significant enemy air opposition. The Japanese air forces in Burma were depleted by mid-1944 through cumulative losses that exceeded their replacement capacity. Allied air superiority was essentially complete, which made operations safer but also less dramatic than the earlier period when every mission involved potential aerial combat. Philip's departure from the China-Burma-India theater occurred in mid-September 1944 after completing 103 combat missions over 15 months. His squadron held a brief farewell gathering the evening before his departure. Fellow pilots gave speeches acknowledging Philip's contributions and his remarkable December 13th mission that had become legendary throughout the 10th Air Force. Philip responded with characteristic modesty, thanking his squadron mates and ground crew for their support and expressing confidence that the war would be won through the collective efforts of thousands of servicemen rather than individual achievements. The journey home took approximately 2 weeks via the same circuitous route Philip had traveled coming to India. Multiple air transports and ships carried him from Dinjan to Calcutta to Australia to Pearl Harbor to San Francisco. The travel was tedious and uncomfortable, but Philip used the time to process his combat experiences and contemplate his future. He was 24 years old with 7 confirmed aerial victories, a Silver Star Medal, and survival through circumstances that had killed many of his peers. The question now was what came next. Would he remain in military service or separate and pursue civilian opportunities? The decision would shape the remainder of his life. Philip arrived in San Francisco in late September 1944 and processed through the West Coast Separation Center, where returning combat veterans received medical examinations, updated service records, and assignment orders. His medical examination noted that he had recovered completely from the carbon monoxide poisoning sustained during the December mission. His physical condition was generally good, though he showed signs of tropical diseases common among personnel who served in the CBI theater. Recurring malaria would plague him periodically for years, requiring medication and causing occasional debilitating symptoms. His assignment orders directed him to 30 days of leave, followed by reporting to Randolph Field in Texas for duty as a flight instructor. The assignment was standard for combat veterans who were considered too valuable to risk in additional combat, but whose experience was needed to train replacement pilots. Philip was ambivalent about the assignment. Training duty lacked the intensity and immediate impact of combat operations, but it also offered safety and the opportunity to directly influence the next generation of pilots who would deploy to Europe or the Pacific. Philip spent his leave in Tulsa, visiting family for the first time in over 2 years. His parents were shocked by his physical appearance. He had left home in April 1943, weighing approximately 170 pounds, with the healthy appearance of a recent college graduate. He returned in October 1944, weighing approximately 145 pounds, with the gaunt, hollow-eyed look common among men who had served extended periods in tropical combat zones. The weight loss resulted from inadequate nutrition, tropical diseases, and the physical stress of sustained combat operations in harsh environmental conditions. His father tried to understand what Philip had experienced, but the gap between combat reality and civilian perception was too wide to bridge through conversation. William Adair had served briefly in World War I, but had never seen combat. His military experience involved stateside training before the war ended. He couldn't comprehend what his son had endured through 15 months of continuous combat operations in one of the war's most challenging theaters. Philip appreciated his father's attempts to understand, but knew that accurate description would only disturb his parents without providing genuine comprehension. His younger brother James, who was 17 in October 1944, asked constant questions about aerial combat. Philip answered patiently, but edited his descriptions heavily to remove the terror and brutality intrinsic to combat operations. He described flying techniques and aircraft capabilities without dwelling on the deaths he had witnessed and caused. He told acceptable stories about the December 13th mission that emphasized the flying challenges without fully conveying the certainty of death he had felt during multiple points. His brother was satisfied with these sanitized accounts, which was exactly what Philip intended. Philip reported to Randolph Field in November 1944 and began his assignment as flight instructor, training aviation cadets in advanced flying techniques. The work was demanding in different ways than combat had been. Combat required immediate reactions to unpredictable threats. Training required patience with students who made predictable mistakes repeatedly while learning skills that seemed obvious to experienced pilots. Philip had to remember that he had once been a struggling student making the same errors. His combat experience gave him credibility with students, but also made him impatient with mistakes that could kill them during their first combat missions. Randolph Field was one of the premier pilot training installations in the United States. The facility had been operating since the 1930s and had trained thousands of pilots during the war expansion. The infrastructure was extensive with multiple runways, numerous training aircraft, academic facilities, and housing for instructors and students. The base processed hundreds of students simultaneously through the various training phases. Philip was assigned to the advanced training section, where students learned complex maneuvers, formation flying, and instrument procedures before receiving their wings and combat assignments. The training aircraft at Randolph were primarily AT-6 Texan trainers, the same type Philip had flown during his own advanced training in 1942. The AT-6 remained the standard advanced trainer throughout the war, despite being less capable than the fighter's students would eventually fly in combat. The transition from AT-6 to combat aircraft was significant, but the fundamental skills learned in the trainer transferred reasonably well. Philip focused on teaching students proper procedures and sound decision-making rather than advanced tactics. The tactics would come later in their operational training. His job was ensuring they could fly their aircraft competently and safely under various conditions. Philip discovered he had natural aptitude for instruction that surprised him. He could explain complex concepts clearly. He could demonstrate techniques effectively. He could identify specific problems in students flying and provide corrections that actually helped. His combat experience gave him authority that students respected. When Philip explained why certain procedures were important, students listened because they knew he had survived 15 months of combat by following those procedures. His instruction wasn't theoretical. It was practical wisdom earned through experience. The student washout rate at Randolph was approximately 25% during the period Philip served as instructor. Not every aviation cadet who reached advanced training successfully completed the program and received wings. Some washed out due to inability to master required skills despite adequate effort. Others washed out due to fear that prevented them from performing safely. Still others washed out due to poor judgment or lack of discipline that made them dangerous to themselves and others. Philip participated in the evaluation boards that determined which students should continue and which should be eliminated from pilot training. The decisions were difficult but necessary because incompetent pilots killed not only themselves but potentially their crews and fellow pilots. The war in Europe ended in May 1945 while Philip was still at Randolph Field. Germany's surrender was celebrated enthusiastically, but the war against Japan continued. The massive American military machine remained focused on defeating Japan through invasion of the home islands or through blockade and bombardment that would force surrender without invasion. Philip expected he might eventually deploy again to the Pacific Theater as the invasion preparations intensified. But the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 ended the war before Philip faced additional combat deployment. Japan's surrender in August 1945 created immediate questions about post-war military structure and personnel. The Army Air Forces would shrink dramatically from wartime peak to peacetime strength. Millions of servicemen would return to civilian life. Philip faced the decision that all career-minded officers confronted: remain in service during the uncertain peacetime transition or separate and pursue civilian opportunities. Philip was 25 years old with a college degree in engineering and approximately 2,000 flying hours, including combat experience. He could find good civilian employment easily. But he had invested 3 years in developing his military aviation career. Starting over in civilian aviation or engineering seemed like abandoning that investment. Philip decided to remain in service and applied for regular commission in the post-war Air Force. His application was accepted in early 1946. He transitioned from wartime temporary officer with time in grade based on wartime service to permanent career officer with the rank of captain. The transition meant accepting lower rank than he currently held, but provided security and career opportunities that temporary officers wouldn't receive as the military demobilized. Philip judged this a reasonable trade. He was willing to accept temporary rank reduction in exchange for long-term career stability. His continued assignment at Randolph Field through 1946 provided stability during the chaotic demobilization period. Thousands of aviation cadets still needed training despite the war's end because the post-war military would still require pilots for peacetime operations. Philip continued instructing through late 1946, training students who would serve in the peacetime force rather than deploying to combat. The mission was less urgent than wartime training, but still important because peacetime military readiness required competent pilots who could transition quickly to combat operations if future conflicts arose. Philip's personal life during this period remained relatively simple. He dated occasionally, but formed no serious romantic relationships. Military service during the uncertain transition period made long-term commitments difficult. He lived in bachelor officer quarters on base, spent his off-duty time reading and attending movies, and saved money rather than spending on entertainment or consumer goods. His lifestyle was modest by choice rather than necessity. He could have afforded more expensive diversions, but preferred simplicity and financial security. His orders in late 1946 assigned him to Williams Air Force Base in Arizona for transition training into jet aircraft. The Army Air Forces were beginning to transition from propeller-driven aircraft to jets, recognizing that future air combat would be dominated by jet-powered fighters capable of speeds and altitudes impossible for propeller aircraft. Philip would learn to fly the Lockheed P-40 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter. The transition represented significant change from everything Philip had learned during his previous flying career. Jets operated differently than propeller aircraft in fundamental ways that required new techniques and procedures. Philip departed Randolph Field in December 1946 after spending approximately 2 years as flight instructor. He had trained approximately 150 students during that period, sending them to various assignments throughout the Air Force. Some became instructors themselves, others deployed to occupation duty in Germany and Japan. Still others joined operational squadrons that would form the nucleus of the post-war Air Force. Philip took pride in this work, even though it lacked the visibility and recognition that combat operations provided. Every successful student represented competent pilot who would perform effectively and safely throughout their career. That impact extended far beyond Philip's individual achievements. The journey to Williams Air Force Base marked the end of Philip's World War II experiences and the beginning of his peacetime Air Force career. He was 26 years old with approximately 3,000 flying hours, 7 aerial victories, and survival through circumstances that remained remarkable even as the immediate war years receded into history. The December 13, 1943 mission would define his legacy regardless of whatever he accomplished during the remainder of his career. 1 pilot, 1 obsolete fighter, 64 enemy aircraft. The story would be told and retold for decades, inspiring future generations of pilots who faced their own impossible circumstances and needed examples proving that impossible meant nothing when someone refused to quit. Philip Adair arrived at Williams Air Force Base in Arizona in January 1947 for transition training into jet aircraft. The base was located in the desert approximately 30 miles southeast of Phoenix, operating in conditions vastly different from the tropical humidity of the China-Burma-India theater where Philip had flown combat missions. The desert air was dry and clear, providing excellent visibility and stable atmospheric conditions ideal for flight training. Williams had been operating since 1941 and had expanded significantly during the war to train thousands of pilots. Now it was transitioning to become one of the primary jet training facilities as the Army Air Forces modernized its aircraft inventory, the Lockheed P-80. Shooting Star represented revolutionary change from every aircraft Philip had flown previously. The P-80 was powered by a single Allison J-33 turbojet engine, producing approximately 4,000 pounds of thrust rather than horsepower. The jet engine had no propeller, no pistons, no complex mechanical systems translating reciprocating motion into thrust. Instead, compressed air mixed with fuel and burned continuously, producing exhaust gases that generated forward thrust through basic physics. The simplicity was elegant, but the operational characteristics were completely different from propeller aircraft. The academic portion of jet transition training lasted 2 weeks and covered turbojet theory, P-80 systems, emergency procedures, and the fundamentally different flying techniques required for jet aircraft. Instructors emphasized that jets accumulated speed rapidly during descents and required significantly more distance for landing approaches than propeller aircraft. The P-80 had no propeller to generate drag and slow the aircraft. Once you started descending, momentum carried you forward relentlessly. Pilots accustomed to propeller aircraft instinctively expected certain responses that jets simply didn't provide. Unlearning those instincts was critical to safe jet operations. Philip's first jet flight occurred on February 3, 1947, in a P-80, with an instructor pilot occupying the rear seat position. The aircraft was a 2-seat trainer variant designated TP-80C, with tandem seating configuration. Philip occupied the front seat with full flight controls, while the instructor monitored from behind and could take control if necessary. The takeoff roll was longer than propeller aircraft required, but acceleration was smooth and powerful once the engine spooled to full thrust. Liftoff speed was approximately 130 miles per hour, slightly faster than the P-40, but not dramatically different. But everything after takeoff was different. The jet climbed at angles impossible for propeller aircraft. The absence of propeller torque meant no asymmetric forces trying to yaw the aircraft during high-power operations. The cockpit was quieter without the roar of a piston engine and propeller directly ahead. The engine response was slower than piston engines, requiring pilots to anticipate power needs rather than making immediate power changes. And the speed accumulated frighteningly fast during any descent or level flight at low altitude where air density was high. Philip completed approximately 20 flights in the TP-80C during February and March 1947, gradually mastering the techniques required for safe jet operations. He learned to plan approaches carefully because jets couldn't slow down quickly if you arrived at landing pattern too fast or too high. He learned to manage fuel carefully because jets consumed fuel at rates that could drain tanks rapidly if you weren't attentive. He learned to respect the tremendous speed capability that could put you into dangerous situations before you recognized what was happening. His solo flight in a single-seat P-80C occurred in late March, after the instructor certified Philip was ready for independent operations. The single-seat jet lacked the safety net of an instructor who could take control during emergencies. Philip was entirely responsible for all decisions and actions from engine start through landing. The solo flight lasted approximately 45 minutes and included takeoff, climb to altitude, practice maneuvers, and landing approach. Philip performed adequately, though not brilliantly. Jet flying required precision that would only come through additional practice and experience. Philip completed jet transition training in April 1947 and received qualification in the P-40 Shooting Star. His orders assigned him to the 1st Fighter Group based at March Field in California, approximately 60 miles east of Los Angeles. The 1st Fighter Group was one of the Air Force's premier fighter units with history extending back to World War I. The group was transitioning from P-51 Mustangs to P-80 jets during early 1947 as part of the broader Air Force modernization program. Philip would serve as a line pilot in the 27th Fighter Squadron, one of 3 squadrons comprising the group. March Field was a large, permanent installation that had operated since the 1920s. The base supported multiple flying units, plus extensive support infrastructure. Living conditions were far superior to the primitive forward airfields Philip had known in India and Burma. Officers lived in permanent quarters with actual beds, running water, and electricity that functioned reliably. The mess halls served decent food regularly. Medical facilities could handle routine care and emergencies. The contrast with wartime conditions in the CBI theater was remarkable and welcome. Philip's duties at March Field during 1947 and 48 involved primarily peacetime training and readiness operations. The squadron flew practice missions maintaining proficiency in formation, flying, navigation, and simulated combat tactics. They participated in exercises with other units developing doctrine for jet fighter employment. They stood alert duties ready to intercept any unidentified aircraft approaching the West Coast, though such incidents were rare during the immediate post-war period. The work was routine, but necessary to maintain the combat readiness that peacetime military forces required. The creation of the independent United States Air Force in September 1947 marked significant organizational change. The Air Force separated from the Army and became a co-equal military service with its own secretary, chief of staff, and budget. For officers like Philip, who had served in the Army Air Forces, the change was mainly administrative. They wore new uniforms with Air Force insignia rather than Army Air Force's patches. Their service branch was now United States Air Force rather than United States Army. But their daily duties and career progression remained essentially unchanged. They flew the same aircraft from the same bases, doing the same missions under new organizational structure. Philip's personal life during this period remained relatively simple and focused on his career. He dated occasionally, but formed no serious romantic relationships. Military service during peacetime still involved uncertainties that made long-term commitments difficult. Assignments could change with minimal notice. Future conflicts were always possible despite the current peace. Philip preferred maintaining flexibility rather than making commitments that military life might disrupt. He lived in bachelor officer quarters, spent off-duty time reading and exercising, and saved money rather than spending on entertainment or consumer goods. His social circle consisted primarily of fellow officers from the squadron. They gathered at the officers' club for drinks and conversation. They played poker for modest stakes. They attended base social events and occasional trips to Los Angeles for entertainment. The camaraderie was important, but superficial compared to the bonds Philip had formed with squadron mates during combat operations in Burma. Shared danger created connections that peacetime service simply couldn't replicate. Philip maintained cordial relationships with his squadron mates, but didn't develop the deep friendships that combat forged. The squadron transitioned from P-80 Shooting Stars to F-86 Sabre jets during 1949 as the Air Force continued modernizing its fighter inventory. The F-86 was significantly more capable than the P-80, with swept wings that improved high-speed performance and more powerful engine that provided better acceleration and climb rate. The swept-wing configuration was revolutionary, representing American adaptation of German aeronautical research captured after World War II. The swept wings delayed the onset of compressibility problems that limited straight-wing jets like the P-80 to subsonic speeds. Philip's transition to the F-86 occurred during summer 1949 through a combination of academic instruction and flight training. The F-86 flew similarly to the P-80 in most respects, but had better performance at high speeds approaching the sound barrier. The aircraft could exceed 650 miles per hour in level flight and could approach 700 miles per hour in dives, speeds that would have been unimaginable in propeller aircraft. The F-86 would become America's primary air superiority fighter during the Korean War and would prove decisively superior to the Soviet-designed MiG-15 fighters that Communist forces would deploy. The outbreak of the Korean War on June 25, 1950, created immediate mobilization and deployment requirements. North Korean forces invaded South Korea with Soviet support, quickly overwhelming South Korean defenders and threatening to conquer the entire peninsula. The United States committed military forces under United Nations mandate to defend South Korea and repel the invasion. The Air Force deployed fighter squadrons to bases in Japan and South Korea to provide air support for ground forces and establish air superiority over Communist forces. Philip's squadron received deployment orders in December 1950 as part of the massive reinforcement being sent to the Korean theater. The unit would deploy to Kimpo Air Base near Seoul, South Korea, flying F-86 Sabres in air superiority and ground attack missions against North Korean and Chinese forces. Philip was 29 years old, significantly older than most pilots deploying to Korea, who were in their early 20s. His World War II combat experience made him one of the more experienced pilots in the squadron, despite the 7-year gap since his last combat operations. The deployment to Korea occurred in January 1951 via transport aircraft, flying the Pacific route through Hawaii and Japan. Philip and his squadron mates arrived at Kimpo to find conditions dramatically different from their comfortable peacetime base at March Field. Kimpo was a frontline combat airfield subjected to periodic artillery fire and air attacks. The facilities were primitive with minimal infrastructure. Living conditions were harsh with limited heating during the brutal Korean winter. The contrast with peacetime service was stark and immediate. Philip flew his first Korean War combat mission on January 20, 1951, a ground attack mission against North Korean supply lines in the central sector of the front. The mission involved strafing trucks and railroad facilities with the F-86's 650 caliber machine guns. The aircraft carried the same weapons Philip had used in the P-40 during World War II, though the delivery platform was far more capable. The mission encountered light anti-aircraft fire, but no enemy fighters. Philip returned safely after approximately 90 minutes of flight time. Subsequent missions during early 1951 followed similar patterns. Most were ground attack operations supporting United Nations forces engaged in heavy fighting against Chinese forces that had intervened in late 1950. The Chinese offensive had pushed UN forces south from the Yalu River back toward Seoul, creating desperate defensive battles throughout the winter. Air power was critical to slowing the Chinese advance and providing fire support for ground units. Philip's squadron flew multiple missions daily when weather permitted, attacking enemy troop concentrations, supply lines, and artillery positions. Air-to-air combat in Korea was concentrated primarily in the northwestern region near the Yalu River, where communist MiG-15 fighters operated from bases in Manchuria that were off-limits to UN air attacks for political reasons. This area became known as MiG Alley, where daily battles occurred between American F-86 Sabres and communist MiGs. Philip's squadron operated primarily in Central and Eastern Korea, supporting ground forces rather than engaging in fighter sweeps over MiG Alley. His missions involved more ground attack than air combat, which was tactically necessary but less prestigious than the air superiority missions flown in MiG Alley. Philip did encounter enemy aircraft on several occasions during his Korean tour. MiG-15 fighters occasionally ventured south from their sanctuary bases to attack UN air operations. On March 7, 1951, Philip's flight of 4 F-86s was returning from a ground attack mission when they encountered 6 MiGs attempting to intercept a formation of B-29 bombers. The American fighters immediately engaged to protect the bombers. The resulting combat was brief and chaotic. The MiG-15 was roughly equivalent to the F-86 in performance, with advantages in high-altitude operations and disadvantages in pilot training and tactics. The communist pilots were competent, but not exceptional. They broke off their attack on the bombers when the F-86s intervened and attempted to escape back north toward the Yalu. Philip pursued one MiG for approximately 2 minutes, firing multiple bursts without achieving hits. The MiG pilot maneuvered aggressively and eventually extended away using slight speed advantage. Philip claimed a probable damaged aircraft based on seeing impacts on the MiG's wing, but couldn't claim a kill without visual confirmation of destruction or crash. Similar engagements occurred 3 more times during Philip's Korean tour. He fired at enemy aircraft on each occasion without achieving confirmed kills. The MiG pilots were skilled at breaking contact and escaping when outnumbered or outmaneuvered. They fought when they had advantage and fled when they didn't. This tactical discipline prevented them from being destroyed, but also limited their effectiveness. The UN air forces maintained general air superiority throughout the war, despite the MiG threat, because communist fighters couldn't sustain combat against the numerically superior and better coordinated UN air operations. Philip completed 60 combat missions during his Korean deployment from January through August 1951. The missions accumulated more slowly than his World War II combat tour because Korean weather was worse, and missions were occasionally canceled due to snow, fog, or low clouds that prevented safe operations. His squadron lost 3 pilots during this period to anti-aircraft fire and accidents. No squadron aircraft were shot down by MiGs. The casualty rate was significantly lower than the Burma campaign during World War II, reflecting both improved aircraft survivability and less intense air combat in the Korean theater. Philip received orders for rotation back to the United States in August 1951 after completing 8 months in Korea and achieving the 60-mission threshold that qualified most pilots for rotation. His combat record now included 103 missions in World War II and 60 missions in Korea, total 163 combat missions over 2 wars. His aerial victory total remained 7 confirmed from World War II without additions from Korea. He had fired at enemy aircraft multiple times in Korea, but hadn't achieved the visual confirmation required for kills. The probable damaged claims didn't count toward official victory totals. He departed Korea in September 1951 and returned to the United States via transport aircraft through Japan and Hawaii. The journey provided time to process his second combat tour and compare it to his World War II experiences. Korea had been less intense than Burma in most respects. The aircraft were more capable. The support infrastructure was better. The living conditions, while harsh, were superior to forward airfields in India. But the sense of purpose was less clear. World War II had been existential struggle against enemies threatening civilization itself. Korea was limited war with restricted objectives and political constraints that prevented pursuing decisive victory. Philip understood the strategic logic, but found the limitations frustrating. His post-Korea assignment sent him to Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada as an instructor at the Fighter Weapons School, the Air Force's advanced tactical training facility. The Fighter Weapons School taught experienced fighter pilots advanced tactics, weapons employment, and mission planning. Students were typically captains and majors with operational experience who would return to their squadrons as tactical experts. Philip's combat experience in 2 wars qualified him well for instructing these advanced students. Nellis was located in the desert north of Las Vegas and operated one of the largest training ranges in the United States. The range provided unrestricted airspace where fighters could practice tactics without interference from civilian air traffic or terrain restrictions. Students could engage in realistic simulated combat scenarios that closely approximated actual war conditions. The training was demanding and sometimes dangerous. Accidents occurred when pilots pushed their aircraft and themselves to limits during aggressive maneuvering. But the training was also highly effective at producing tactically competent fighter pilots who could employ their aircraft and weapons effectively in combat. Philip served at Nellis from late 1951 through 1954, teaching multiple classes of approximately 20 students each. The curriculum covered air-to-air combat tactics, ground attack procedures, weapons delivery techniques, and mission planning. Philip taught primarily air-to-air tactics based on his combat experience against Japanese and communist fighters. He emphasized situational awareness, energy management, and teamwork rather than individual aerobatic skill. Successful fighter pilots survived through sound tactics and mutual support rather than flashy maneuvering. His students respected Philip's combat experience and listened carefully to his instruction. Unlike many instructors who taught theoretical tactics without combat validation, Philip could describe actual engagements and explain what worked and what didn't based on personal experience. His December 13, 1943 mission had become somewhat legendary within the fighter pilot community. Students knew they were being instructed by the pilot who had engaged 64 Japanese aircraft alone and survived through improvised flying techniques. That credibility made his instruction more impactful. Philip met Sarah Mitchell during his assignment at Nellis. Sarah was a school teacher in Las Vegas who had moved west from Pennsylvania after completing her education degree. They met at a social event in Las Vegas in early 1952 and began dating casually. Sarah was 26 years old, intelligent, independent, and unimpressed by military rank or combat decorations. She evaluated Philip based on his character and behavior rather than his achievements. Philip found this refreshing after years of being defined primarily by his military service. Their relationship developed gradually over approximately 2 years. Sarah understood that Philip's career involved uncertainties, including future deployments and relocations. She had seen enough military marriages struggle under those pressures to recognize the challenges, but she also saw qualities in Philip that attracted her: integrity, competence, modesty despite significant achievements, and genuine kindness beneath the disciplined military exterior. Philip was equally attracted to Sarah's intelligence and independence. She had her own career and interests rather than defining herself entirely through her husband's identity. They married in June 1954 in a small ceremony in Las Vegas, attended by approximately 50 people, including family members who traveled from Oklahoma and Pennsylvania, plus fellow officers from Nellis. The wedding was simple and inexpensive by design. Neither Philip nor Sarah wanted elaborate ceremony or excessive spending. They valued substance over appearance, a perspective that would characterize their marriage throughout its duration. Philip received orders in late 1954 for attendance at Air Command and Staff College at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. The college was a professional military education program for mid-level officers being groomed for senior leadership positions. The curriculum covered strategy, operations, logistics, personnel management, and the non-flying aspects of military aviation that senior officers needed to understand. Attendance was competitive, and selection indicated the Air Force valued the officer's potential for future advancement. Philip's selection reflected his combat record, instructing experience, and positive performance evaluations throughout his career. The academic year at Air Command and Staff College lasted from August 1954 through June 1955. Philip and Sarah relocated to Montgomery, Alabama, where they established their first household together. Sarah found teaching position at a local elementary school, while Philip attended classes and completed coursework. The academic demands were significant but manageable for someone with Philip's discipline and work ethic. He performed well throughout the year and graduated with recommendations for future command assignments. Philip was promoted to major in July 1955 after 13 years of commissioned service. The promotion was timely and expected for an officer with his record. Major was a critical rank because it represented transition from junior officer focused primarily on operational duties to mid-level officer expected to handle broader responsibilities, including staff work and supervisory positions. Philip's career was progressing normally toward the senior ranks, where colonels and generals commanded large organizations and influenced Air Force policy. His post-college assignment sent him to Tactical Air Command Headquarters at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia as Operations Staff Officer. The position involved planning and coordinating fighter operations for the command that controlled most Air Force tactical fighter units. Philip worked on developing tactics, evaluating new weapons systems, and planning exercises that tested and refined operational procedures. The work was intellectually demanding and strategically important, but lacked the immediate satisfaction of operational flying and instructing. Philip missed flying regularly, but understood that career progression required accepting staff assignments. Sarah and Philip's first child, a daughter named Jennifer, was born in March 1956, while Philip was assigned at Langley. Fatherhood was new experience for Philip at age 35. He had focused entirely on his career through his 20s and early 30s. Now he had responsibilities beyond military service. The adjustment was significant, but welcome. Philip discovered he enjoyed fatherhood more than he had anticipated. Watching his daughter grow and develop provided satisfaction that complemented rather than competed with his career. Their second child, a son named Robert, was born in December 1957. The family was expanding during the relatively stable period at Langley that allowed Philip to be present for his children's early years. Many military families experienced extended separations during deployments or remote assignments. Philip's staff position at Langley meant he came home every evening and could participate in family life more consistently than operational assignments would have permitted. Sarah appreciated this stability, even though she understood it was temporary. Future assignments would inevitably disrupt the current routine. Philip's staff tour at Langley lasted 3 years, from 1955 through '58. He was then assigned to command a fighter squadron at George Air Force Base in California. The command assignment was significant career progression. Squadron commander was typically a lieutenant colonel position, though major selects like Philip occasionally received squadron commands as preparation for promotion. Philip would command approximately 25 F-100 Super Sabre jets and 250 personnel, including pilots, maintenance technicians, and administrative staff. George Air Force Base was located in the Mojave Desert, approximately 60 miles northeast of Los Angeles. The base supported multiple fighter squadrons conducting training and maintaining readiness for potential deployment. Philip assumed command in July 1958 and immediately focused on improving his squadron's combat readiness. He established demanding training standards, personally flew with each pilot to evaluate their capabilities, and identified weaknesses that needed correction. Some officers resented his intensity, but most recognized that Philip was preparing them to survive and succeed in combat if war occurred. During Philip's two-year command from 1958 through 60, his squadron consistently received excellent ratings during operational readiness inspections and performed well during exercises against other units. Philip's combat experience and instructing background gave him credibility with his pilots, who respected leaders with proven competence. He didn't ask them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. He flew demanding missions and demonstrated the standards he expected. This leadership approach was effective because it was authentic rather than merely following doctrinal prescriptions about how commanders should lead. Philip was promoted to lieutenant colonel in January 1960 after 17 years of commissioned service. The promotion was somewhat delayed compared to some peers who had achieved lieutenant colonel after 15 years. The delay probably reflected Philip's focus on operational competency rather than political networking and the self-promotion that often accelerated career advancement. But lieutenant colonel was still significant achievement, placing Philip in position for further advancement toward senior ranks. His career remained on trajectory toward colonel and potentially beyond if circumstances aligned favorably. His next assignment after relinquishing squadron command in 1960 sent him to the Pentagon for a 3-year staff tour in the Operations Directorate. Pentagon assignments were simultaneously prestigious and frustrating. Prestigious because they placed officers at the center of Air Force policy and planning. Frustrating because bureaucratic processes and political considerations often overrode military effectiveness. Philip would spend 3 years navigating Pentagon politics while contributing to operations planning for the escalating American involvement in Vietnam. The assignment would test his patience and professional flexibility in ways that operational flying never had. Philip Adair's Pentagon assignment began in July 1960 when he reported to the Operations Directorate at Air Force Headquarters in Washington. The Pentagon was a massive bureaucratic complex housing over 20,000 military and civilian personnel working on every aspect of national defense. The building itself was overwhelming with its 5 concentric rings, 17.5 miles of corridors, and organizational complexity that required months to navigate effectively. Philip's office was located in the Operations Directorate, where he would contribute to planning Air Force tactical operations worldwide, with particular focus on the developing situation in Southeast Asia. The American involvement in Vietnam was escalating during the early 1960s, though combat operations remained relatively limited compared to what would come later. Military advisors were supporting South Vietnamese forces against communist insurgents. Air Force units were providing support through reconnaissance, transport, and limited strike missions. But the situation was deteriorating as North Vietnam increased support for Viet Cong guerrillas operating in South Vietnam. Pentagon planners were developing contingency plans for expanded American involvement, including potential deployment of ground forces and sustained air campaigns against North Vietnam. Philip's role involved analyzing tactical air operations, evaluating new weapons and tactics, and contributing to planning documents that would guide Air Force operations if full-scale intervention became necessary. The work was intellectually demanding and strategically significant, but Philip found the Pentagon environment frustrating in ways he hadn't anticipated. Decisions were driven more by political considerations and bureaucratic processes than military effectiveness. Senior leaders worried more about congressional relations and budget allocations than operational competency. The distance between Pentagon planners and the forces actually executing missions created disconnect between plans and reality. Philip could see strategic and tactical mistakes being made as American involvement deepened. The restrictions placed on air operations against North Vietnam prevented decisive use of air power while still committing forces to combat. The gradual escalation gave North Vietnam time to adapt and strengthen defenses rather than overwhelming them through concentrated force. The political constraints prevented attacking targets in Laos and Cambodia, where North Vietnamese forces operated with impunity. Philip understood the political logic behind these restrictions, but believed they undermined military effectiveness and prolonged the conflict unnecessarily. He expressed these concerns through appropriate channels, including memoranda to senior officers and participation in planning conferences. But junior field-grade officers like Philip had minimal influence on policy decisions made at levels far above his position. The Secretary of Defense and the President made the critical decisions based on political and diplomatic considerations that military officers could advise but not control. Philip did his job professionally and competently, but was relieved when his Pentagon tour ended in June 1963, after 3 years navigating bureaucratic politics. His next assignment sent him back to operational duty as deputy commander of a fighter wing at MacDill Air Force Base in Florida. The position was a significant step toward wing command, which was colonel-level responsibility typically awarded to officers being groomed for senior leadership. Philip would serve as second-in-command of a wing consisting of approximately 72 F-4 Phantom aircraft and 1,500 personnel. The deputy commander handled day-to-day operations, allowing the wing commander to focus on broader responsibilities, including relations with senior leadership and strategic planning. MacDill was located on peninsula extending into Tampa Bay, providing excellent weather for year-round flight operations. The base supported multiple flying units, plus extensive support infrastructure. The wing's mission included air defense for southeastern United States and training replacement crews for deployment to Vietnam as American involvement expanded dramatically during the mid-1960s. Philip's operational experience and instructing background made him well-suited for this training mission. He could ensure crews were properly prepared for the combat operations they would face in Southeast Asia. The F-4 Phantom was the Air Force's premier multi-role fighter during the 1960s, capable of air superiority, ground attack, and reconnaissance missions. The aircraft was significantly more complex than the P-40S Philip had flown in World War II or the F-86S he had flown in Korea. The Phantom carried sophisticated radar, guided missiles, and advanced avionics that required extensive training to employ effectively. Philip had to learn these systems himself before he could effectively supervise training of younger pilots who would operate the aircraft in combat. Philip and Sarah's third child, a daughter named Catherine, was born in November 1964 while Philip was serving at MacDill. The family was settled in Tampa, where they would remain for most of the next decade through Philip's various assignments at the base. Sarah continued teaching elementary school when possible, though the demands of raising 3 children limited her career options. The older children, Jennifer and Robert, were now in school themselves and were developing their own interests and personalities. Family life provided stability and purpose beyond Philip's military career. The escalation of American involvement in Vietnam during 1965 brought increased operational tempo at MacDill. The wing was training and deploying air crews continuously as the war expanded. Philip worked 12 to 14-hour days managing the training program, evaluating pilot proficiency, and coordinating with other bases to ensure crews were properly prepared before deployment. Some crews he personally knew deployed to Vietnam and didn't return. The casualty rates weren't as severe as World War II, but losses were steady and cumulative. Philip attended memorial services for fallen pilots and wrote letters to families, difficult duties that commanders couldn't delegate. Philip received his own wing command in January 1967, when the previous wing commander was promoted and reassigned. Philip assumed command with the rank of lieutenant colonel, though wing commanders were typically full colonels. The early command reflected Philip's strong performance as deputy commander and the Air Force's need to promote competent officers rapidly as the war demanded expanded leadership. Philip would command the wing for approximately 2.5 years, one of the longest and most significant leadership positions of his career. Wing command brought comprehensive responsibility for all aspects of operations, maintenance, training, administration, and personnel management. Philip oversaw approximately 1,500 people, including pilots, maintenance technicians, administrative staff, and support personnel. His decisions affected readiness, safety, effectiveness, and morale of everyone in the organization. The responsibility was substantial, but Philip was prepared through years of progressive leadership experience. He had commanded a squadron. He had served as deputy wing commander. He understood what worked and what didn't in large, complex organizations. Philip's command philosophy emphasized 3 priorities: safety, readiness, and people. Safety was paramount because training accidents killed pilots and destroyed expensive aircraft without contributing to mission success. Philip insisted on rigorous procedures, proper supervision, and conservative decision-making when weather or mechanical conditions were marginal. Some pilots chafed under these restrictions, but Philip was willing to accept unpopularity to prevent unnecessary casualties. Readiness meant maintaining high standards and demanding performance that prepared crews for combat conditions. People meant caring for the welfare of everyone in the organization and recognizing that competent, motivated personnel were the wing's most valuable asset. The wing performed excellently during Philip's command from 1967 through '69. Operational readiness inspections consistently rated the wing as highly effective. Safety record was better than average for comparable units. Morale remained relatively high despite the stresses of sustained wartime operations. Training effectiveness was validated by the performance of crews deployed to Vietnam who reported they felt properly prepared for the conditions they encountered. Philip's leadership was recognized through awards and positive evaluations from senior officers who visited the base. Philip was promoted to full colonel in January 1969 after 26 years of commissioned service. The promotion was a significant achievement, placing Philip among the senior 5% of Air Force officers. Colonel was the highest rank most officers achieved during their careers. Further promotion to general officer rank required political skills, connections, and circumstances that Philip lacked. He was an excellent operational officer and competent administrator, but wasn't particularly skilled at networking and self-promotion that often determined who received stars. Philip accepted this limitation and focused on performing his current duties rather than pursuing advancement aggressively. He relinquished wing command in June 1969 after 2.5 years. His final change of command ceremony was attended by approximately 500 personnel plus senior officers from higher headquarters. The outgoing commander's farewell speech typically listed achievements and thanked key personnel. Philip kept his speech brief and focused on crediting his subordinates for the wing's success rather than claiming personal credit. He thanked the maintenance personnel who kept aircraft flying. He thanked the administrative staff who handled the endless paperwork that complex organizations generated. He thanked the pilots who flew demanding missions daily, and he thanked his family for supporting him through the demanding assignment. Philip's next assignment was staff position at Tactical Air Command Headquarters in Virginia. The position was appropriate for a colonel with Philip's experience, but represented step back from the operational command he had enjoyed at MacDill. Staff work was necessary but less satisfying than commanding operational units. Philip accepted the assignment, understanding that career progression often involved alternating between operational commands and staff positions. He and Sarah relocated to Virginia, though their children remained in Florida for school, visiting during breaks and holidays. The family separation was difficult but common for military families, where career requirements sometimes conflicted with family preferences. The staff assignment lasted approximately 18 months, from mid-1969 through late 1970. Philip contributed to planning and coordinating tactical air operations worldwide. He participated in developing doctrine that would guide future Air Force operations. He evaluated new aircraft and weapons being considered for procurement. The work was important but abstract compared to commanding a wing where Philip could see direct impact of his decisions. He began considering retirement seriously during this period. He was 49 years old with 27 years of commissioned service. He could retire immediately with full benefits or continue serving until forced retirement at age 60. Several factors influenced Philip's retirement decision. Promotion to general officer seemed unlikely given his limited political connections and preference for operational assignments over Pentagon politics. Continuing in staff positions would be intellectually satisfying, but lacked the operational impact he valued. His children were now teenagers who would benefit from stability rather than additional relocations. Sarah had endured decades of military spouse hardships and deserved stability, and Philip himself felt ready to transition to civilian life while still young enough to pursue second career or simply enjoy retirement without military demands. Philip submitted his retirement request in December 1970, requesting retirement effective June 1971. The Air Force approved his request without difficulty. Officers with his experience and service record could retire voluntarily whenever they chose. The formal retirement process involved several months of paperwork, physical examinations, counseling about retirement benefits, and planning the retirement ceremony. Philip handled these administrative requirements while completing his final months of active duty. His retirement ceremony was held at Langley Air Force Base in May 1971. Approximately 200 people attended, including family members, fellow officers Philip had served with over nearly 30 years, and senior Air Force leadership. The ceremony followed traditional format with speeches recognizing Philip's service, presentation of retirement certificate and flag, and Philip's farewell remarks. The speeches acknowledged his combat record in 2 wars, his command experience, his instructing contributions, and his professional competence throughout his career. The retirement citation summarized Philip's service comprehensively. Commissioned 1943. Combat Service China-Burma-India Theater 1943-44. 103 combat missions. 7 confirmed aerial victories. Silver Star, Distinguished Flying Cross, Air Medal with Oak Leaf Clusters, Purple Heart. Post-war service included Korean War combat, 60 missions. Multiple command assignments including squadron and wing command. Staff assignments at major commands and Pentagon. 30 years of honorable and distinguished service. Colonel Philip Randolph Adair was authorized to retire with full benefits and gratitude of the Air Force and nation he had served loyally throughout his adult life. Philip's farewell remarks were characteristic, brief, and focused on others rather than himself. He thanked fellow officers who had supported him throughout his career. He thanked enlisted personnel whose competence and dedication made officers look good. He thanked his family for enduring hardships that military service imposed. He expressed confidence in the younger generation of officers and airmen who would continue the Air Force's mission. And he acknowledged that his achievements reflected the contributions of thousands of others rather than individual brilliance. The modesty was genuine rather than false humility. Philip truly believed success resulted from collective effort rather than individual heroics. Philip and Sarah settled in Tampa, Florida, near MacDill, where Philip had commanded his wing. They purchased house in suburb with good schools for their children who would complete high school in Tampa. The transition from military to civilian life was significant adjustment. Philip no longer had the structure and purpose that military service provided. He no longer wore uniform or held rank or commanded personnel. He was simply another civilian retiree trying to build meaningful life after decades focused on military service. Philip found employment as aviation consultant for defense contractor that developed aircraft and weapons systems. The company valued his operational experience and combat background. Philip provided expertise on fighter tactics, weapons employment, and practical considerations that engineers and program managers sometimes overlooked. The work was part-time, allowing him flexibility to travel, pursue hobbies, and spend time with family. The income supplemented his military retirement pay and provided financial security without consuming his entire time and energy. His civilian years were quieter and more routine than his military career. He attended his children's school events and activities. He participated in community organizations, including local veterans groups. He maintained contact with fellow retirees from his various assignments and occasionally attended Air Force reunions where surviving members of his World War II and Korean War units gathered. He traveled with Sarah when possible, visiting national parks and historical sites they had never had time to see during his military career. The pace was slower and less intense than active duty, but satisfying in different ways. Philip rarely discussed his combat experiences publicly, even after retirement. He wasn't secretive, but simply didn't see value in repeatedly recounting decades-old events. When asked about the December 13, 1943 mission, where he had engaged 64 Japanese aircraft alone, Philip's response was characteristically modest. He had done what the situation required. The damaged controls and inverted flying had been improvisation born from necessity rather than brilliant tactics. He had been lucky to survive. Thousands of other pilots had performed similar acts of courage, and many hadn't survived. His survival and success didn't make him special, just fortunate. This modesty was typical of his generation of combat veterans. They had fought because duty required it. They had survived through skill and luck. They returned home and built productive lives without dwelling on wartime experiences or seeking recognition for past achievements. The greatest generation label that later historians applied to World War II veterans would have seemed strange and excessive to Philip. He had simply done his job under difficult circumstances as millions of others had done. The war was important, but also past, and dwelling on the past prevented living fully in the present. Philip's health remained reasonably good through his 60s and 70s, though he experienced typical age-related issues. Recurring malaria from his service in Burma required periodic treatment. Joint problems from decades of high-G flying caused chronic pain that worsened with age. Hearing loss from engine noise and gunfire made conversation difficult in crowded environments. But he maintained active lifestyle, including regular exercise, travel, and participation in family activities. He watched his children graduate college, establish careers, marry, and provide him with grandchildren who brought new joy to his later years. Sarah remained Philip's closest companion and strongest support throughout retirement. They had been married over 50 years by the time Philip reached his 80s. She had endured the hardships of military spouse life, including frequent relocations, extended separations, and constant uncertainty about future assignments. Retirement finally provided the stability she had rarely experienced during Philip's career. They established roots in Tampa, developed lasting friendships in their community, and enjoyed the comfortable routine that military life had never allowed. Philip maintained interest in aviation throughout retirement. He attended air shows when possible and kept current on developments in fighter aircraft and tactics. The technology had advanced dramatically since his flying days. Modern fighters were computer-controlled with sophisticated sensors and weapons that made the P-40S and F-86S he had flown seem primitive. But the fundamental principles of air combat remained largely unchanged. Energy management, situational awareness, and teamwork were still critical to success, regardless of technology level. Philip occasionally provided commentary at air shows or spoke to school groups about aviation history, always emphasizing the contributions of many rather than focusing on his individual achievements. His consulting work continued part-time through his late 70s, though the frequency decreased as his energy level declined with age. Defense contractors still valued his insights, but also understood that someone approaching 80 years old couldn't maintain the work pace of younger consultants. Philip gradually reduced his consulting commitments during his late 70s, finally ending the work completely around age 79 when health issues made regular travel impractical. Philip's 80th birthday in March 2000 was celebrated with family gathering at his home in Tampa. His 3 children attended with their spouses and Philip's 7 grandchildren. The celebration was quiet and personal rather than an elaborate public event. Philip had never sought public attention and didn't want his birthday becoming media spectacle. He preferred spending time with family and reflecting privately on 8 decades of life that had included experiences most people couldn't imagine. The early 2000s brought typical challenges of advanced age. Philip's mobility declined as joint problems worsened. His hearing continued deteriorating despite hearing aids. His vision remained adequate, but not what it had been. He required medication for various age-related conditions, including high blood pressure and heart disease. But his mind remained sharp and his memory intact. He could recall details from missions flown 60 years earlier with precision that amazed his family. The traumatic experiences of combat had apparently etched themselves permanently into his memory in ways that ordinary experiences didn't. The 80th anniversary of the December 13, 1943 mission in December 2023 brought renewed media attention to Philip's story. Military historians and aviation enthusiasts contacted him requesting interviews about the mission and his techniques for surviving with damaged flight controls. Philip granted several interviews reluctantly, understanding that the story had historical significance even though recounting it was emotionally difficult. The memories remained vivid despite 70 years having passed. He could still feel the fear, smell the smoke, hear the engine failing. Time didn't diminish the intensity of traumatic memories, even when everything else faded. Philip's health declined noticeably during his mid-80s. Heart disease that had been manageable with medication became progressively worse despite treatment. Mobility problems limited his ability to leave home without assistance. He required home care for daily activities he could no longer perform independently. Sarah remained his primary caregiver with assistance from their children who took turns visiting and helping. The decline was gradual but relentless, typical progression for someone approaching 90 years old with accumulated health problems from decades of physical stress. Philip died on November 3, 2009, at age 89 from complications related to heart disease. He had been hospitalized several days earlier when his condition deteriorated beyond what home care could manage. His family was present during his final hours. He was conscious and aware, though weak and struggling to breathe. His final words to his family were consistent with how he had lived. He told them he had no regrets. He had done his duty. He had lived fully. He was ready for whatever came next. His obituary in the Tampa Tribune noted his military service and decorations, but focused primarily on his civilian life and family. Colonel Philip Randolph Adair, United States Air Force retired, veteran of World War II and Korea, Silver Star, Distinguished Flying Cross, Air Medal. Survived by wife Sarah, 3 children, 7 grandchildren. Services at MacDill Air Force Base Chapel, followed by burial with full military honors at Florida National Cemetery. The funeral service was held at MacDill on November 7, 2009. Approximately 150 people attended, including family, friends, fellow retirees from MacDill, and several elderly veterans who had served with Philip during World War II. The Air Force Honor Guard performed the ceremony with precision and dignity perfected through thousands of similar services. The flag that had covered Philip's casket was folded carefully and presented to Sarah. Rifle volleys cracked across the cemetery. A bugler played taps, the traditional military farewell. Colonel Philip Adair was laid to rest among fellow veterans who had served their nation through decades of peace and war. His legacy extended beyond his individual service through multiple dimensions. The pilots he had trained during his years as instructor and commander carried forward the lessons he had taught about competence, courage, and sound decision-making. The tactics he had demonstrated during his combat missions influenced fighter doctrine development. The example he had provided of maintaining effectiveness despite impossible circumstances inspired pilots facing their own challenges. But perhaps his greatest legacy was simply demonstrating that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things through determination and skill rather than superhuman abilities. The December 13, 1943 mission remained the defining event of Philip's life, regardless of his subsequent 30-year career and comfortable retirement. That morning over India, when he engaged 64 Japanese aircraft alone and survived through improvised flying techniques, embodied truths about combat and character that transcended the specific circumstances. Courage isn't absence of fear, but action despite fear. Success isn't guaranteed by superior resources, but achieved through skill, determination, and sometimes luck. Individual actions matter even when circumstances seem overwhelming. One person can make difference when difference is needed most. The 80th Fighter Group, the Burma Banshees, had compiled impressive combat record during World War II. The group flew from 1942 through 45 in China-Burma-India theater, supporting Allied operations throughout that difficult campaign. They destroyed 413 Japanese aircraft in aerial combat and 147 on ground. They flew thousands of ground attack missions, destroying vehicles, supplies, and infrastructure that supported Japanese forces. Success came at terrible cost. The group lost 63 pilots killed or missing in action. Many more were wounded or captured. The Death's Head Skull insignia painted on their aircraft became one of most recognized markings in the theater. The P-40 Warhawk never achieved fame of later fighters like P-51 Mustang or P-47 Thunderbolt. It was slower than both. It couldn't fight effectively above 15,000 feet, where thin air degraded Allison engines' performance. By 1943, it was considered obsolete and was being replaced by more modern aircraft in most theaters. But in hands of determined pilots like Philip Adair and his fellow Burma Banshees, the rugged Curtiss fighter proved that specifications mattered less than pilot skill and determination. The P-40 did what was needed when it was needed, and that ultimately was what mattered most. The story of one P-40 pilot disrupting entire Japanese raid endures because it illustrates fundamental truths that remain relevant regardless of technological changes or historical distance. Military effectiveness depends more on human factors than hardware specifications. Courage and determination can overcome apparently insurmountable odds. Innovation and improvisation matter more than rigid adherence to doctrine when circumstances demand solutions that don't exist in manuals. These lessons applied during World War II and remain applicable in contemporary military operations despite dramatic changes in technology and tactics. Philip Adair understood these truths instinctively and lived them throughout his career. He improvised solutions when confronted with problems that had no standard answers. He maintained effectiveness despite fear and physical limitations. He led through example rather than authority. He treated people with respect regardless of rank. He performed his duties competently without seeking recognition or advancement beyond what his abilities merited. These qualities defined his character and explained why he succeeded not just during one extraordinary mission, but throughout 30 years of military service. The memorial stone at Florida National Cemetery marks Philip's grave with simple inscription: Colonel Philip Randolph Adair, United States Air Force, 1920 to 2009, World War II and Korea, Silver Star. The stone lists only basic facts, without elaborating on the extraordinary circumstances those facts represent. But anyone who knows the story understands what lies beneath that simple marker. A man who faced impossible odds and refused to quit. A pilot who flew inverted with destroyed controls rather than accepting certain death. A leader who inspired others through competence and character rather than authority and rank. A veteran who served honorably for 3 decades and lived modestly for 3 more. Philip's wife, Sarah, survived him by several years, passing away in 2013 at age 87. Their 3 children remained in Florida and maintained close contact with extended family, including Philip's 7 grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren who carried forward the family legacy. None of Philip's descendants pursued military careers, choosing instead civilian professions in education, business, and technology. But they remained proud of their grandfather's service and ensured his story was preserved and shared with younger generations who needed examples of courage and competence. The farm boy from Tulsa who watched airplanes pass overhead and dreamed of flying became exactly what he aspired to be. A pilot who made difference when difference mattered most. A leader who influenced hundreds of other pilots through instruction and example. A veteran who served his country honorably through 2 wars and built meaningful civilian life afterward. His greatest achievement wasn't the 7 confirmed aerial victories, or the Silver Star, or the 30 years of service. His greatest achievement was demonstrating that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things through determination, skill, and refusing to accept impossible as final answer. That lesson endures long after the specific circumstances that taught it have faded into history. Colonel Philip Adair proved that one person could make difference. His life demonstrated that courage and competence mattered more than resources or circumstances. That legacy continues inspiring anyone who faces challenges that seem insurmountable and needs reminder that impossible means nothing when someone